Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've debated for months whether I should share this. My family has kept these experiences private for 3 generations, partly because we didn't want the attention, but mostly because we feared people wouldn't believe us. But after what happened last summer, I need to get this off my chest. My name is Daniel Richardson. The Gowen mining camp has been in my family since my grandfather Jack bought it in 1940. It's located deep in Arizona's Mazatzal wilderness, about 17 miles from the nearest dirt road. We're talking seriously remote, no cell service, no electricity, nothing but wilderness for miles in every direction. The property has 2 log cabins, a blacksmith shop and a storage shed, all built by Thomas Gowen, the original owner, after World War I. I grew up hearing stories about the place. Gowen was a silver miner who would make regular trips to the Globe Phoenix stage route with 9 pack burros to trade silver ore for supplies. During one of these trips in the 1920s, he encountered something that would later become a recurring nightmare for our family. According to the story passed down, Gowen was leading his burros along the trail when he came face to face with 2 massive bipedal creatures standing in the middle of the path. One was huge, around 8 feet tall with a massive frame, clearly male. The smaller one appeared to be female. Gowen, terrified but trying to maintain his composure, carefully led his burros around the creatures, which just stood there watching him. When he came back the same way later, they were gone. I always thought this was just a tall tale until I had my own encounter. Last summer, I decided to spend a week at Glen Gowen with my cousin Mark. Neither of us had been there in years, and we wanted to check on the property and maybe do some hiking and fishing. Mark's dad, my Uncle Robert, had experienced several strange things there as a kid, and he warned us to be careful at night. We laughed it off. We arrived after a grueling 6-hour hike carrying heavy backpacks. The cabins were still standing, though time had not been kind to them. The larger cabin where we planned to sleep had a partially collapsed roof, but one corner was still intact enough to set up our sleeping bags. The first day was uneventful. We cleared some brush around the cabins, fixed what we could of the door on the main cabin, and settled in. That night, we built a fire outside and sat talking until about 10 o'clock before turning in. I woke up around 2 in the morning to the sound of something heavy walking around outside. At first, I thought it was a bear. We'd stored our food properly, hanging it from a tree about 100 yards from camp, so I wasn't too worried. But then the footsteps stopped right outside our cabin. The door we'd jerry-rigged earlier in the day suddenly flew open with incredible force. It slammed against the inner wall with a crash that jolted Mark awake. The force was so violent that my sleeping bag actually slid several inches across the dirt floor. "What the hell?" Mark whispered, sitting up. Before I could answer, we heard breathing. Deep, heavy breathing, like something massive was standing in the doorway, but in the pitch darkness, we couldn't see anything. I slowly reached for my flashlight, but Mark grabbed my arm, squeezing it hard enough to hurt. The breathing continued for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then, whatever it was, moved away. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and spaced far apart, like something with an enormous stride was walking away. Neither of us slept the rest of the night. We just sat there with our backs against the wall, knives in hand, listening to every sound outside. At first light, we went outside to look for tracks. The ground was hard and rocky around the cabin, making it difficult to spot anything definitive. But about 20 yards from the cabin, where the soil was softer near a small creek, we found them. Footprints, massive footprints. I've been hunting since I was 12. I know what bear tracks look like. These weren't bear tracks. They were barefoot humanoid prints about 17 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. The stride between them was enormous, nearly 6 feet. No human can make a stride like that. Mark wanted to leave immediately. I convinced him to stay one more day, mainly because I wanted to document what we'd found. I took photos of the tracks with my camera, measuring them against my hunting knife for scale. That day passed without incident, though we both felt on edge. We constantly scanned the tree line, jumping at every snapping twig or rustling bush. I kept thinking about my grandfather's story about the door being forced open during his first visit in 1940. The similarities were eerie. Whatever had pushed our door open had done the same to him over 80 years ago. That night, we reinforced the door with a large log propped against it and decided to take shifts sleeping. I took the first watch while Mark tried to get some rest. Around midnight, the forest went completely silent. If you've spent time in the wilderness, you know how unnatural that is. The constant background noise of insects, frogs, and nocturnal animals just stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. I nudged Mark awake, putting my finger to my lips to keep him quiet. We sat there in silence, straining to hear any sound outside. Then it came, a scream from the ridge above the camp. I've heard mountain lions, coyotes, and all manner of wildlife, but this was different. It started low and rose to a pitch that sent shivers down my spine, a howling, almost wailing sound that was neither fully animal nor human. Mark's face went pale. "That's what my dad described," he whispered, "from when he was a kid in 43. The scream came again, closer this time, maybe 100 yards away. Then we heard something large moving through the brush, coming downhill toward the cabins. The log we'd propped against the door began to vibrate as something pushed against the door from outside, not violently like the night before, but with steady pressure. The log held, but I could see it slowly sliding across the dirt floor as whatever was outside continued to push. In desperation, I grabbed my hunting rifle and fired a shot through the cabin wall, about 2 feet above where the door was. The pressure immediately stopped. We heard rapid footsteps moving away from the cabin, crashing through the underbrush. When dawn finally came, we packed our gear in record time and started the long hike out. But as we were leaving, I noticed something on the blacksmith shop that made my blood run cold. The old metal roof, corroded and weathered by decades of exposure, had a fresh dent in it, a massive indentation about the size of a large frying pan. Something had struck it with incredible force, likely during the night. On our way out, we passed the grave of Thomas Gowen, marked by a pile of rocks beside the trail. The story goes that he died while walking out from the camp years after his encounter. As we passed the grave, I couldn't help but wonder if what happened to us was connected to what happened to him all those years ago. About 5 miles from camp, we stopped to rest near a small stream. While filling our water bottles, Mark suddenly grabbed my arm and pointed silently across the creek. There, half hidden behind a large pine, was a figure. It wasn't fully visible, just a dark shape that seemed to shift behind the tree. But what caught my attention was its height. The pine tree was easily 40 feet tall, and this figure seemed to reach almost a third of the way up it. We froze, staring at it. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching us. After a minute that felt like an hour, Mark whispered, "Let's go, now." We backed away slowly, never taking our eyes off the shape behind the tree. Once we were around a bend in the trail, we practically ran the rest of the way to the trailhead. When we got back to Phoenix, I developed the photos I'd taken of the footprints. They came out clear, showing the massive impressions in the soil. I sent them to a friend who works as a wildlife biologist, asking what could have made them. His response was frustrating. Could be a hoax. If not, I don't know what animal makes a track like this. That night, I called my Uncle Robert, Mark's father, and told him what had happened. There was a long silence on the phone before he said, "It's the same thing that happened to your grandfather, and to me, and to my brother Michael. Whatever they are, They've been there a long time." He went on to tell me more details about his own experiences that I hadn't heard before. In 1944, a year after hearing the screams, something ran downhill through the trees near the camp. My grandfather released his Rhodesian Ridgeback dog, which tracked the creature for a quarter-mile before returning, whimpering and terrified. Something that had never happened before with that brave dog. The most detailed sighting came from my grandfather himself, who once spotted what he described as a juvenile creature near a rock wall not far from the cabins. He described it as having short hair with a flat, round face and dark, round eyes. He compared it to what was then called the abominable snowman, since the term Bigfoot wasn't in common usage yet. My Uncle Robert's older brother Michael had an even more terrifying experience. Shortly after being discharged from military service, he and some friends spent a weekend at the camp. During the night, something jumped onto the roof of the larger cabin, then moved to the smaller one, screaming loudly enough to wake everyone. The men fired rifles through the roof, but found no blood trail the next morning, just massive dents in the metal roofing, similar to what Mark and I had seen. I've spent months researching since our experience, trying to make sense of what happened. I've read accounts from other remote areas in Arizona describing similar creatures. Some Native American tribes in the region have legends of tall, hairy beings that live in the mountains and avoid humans. The scientific part of my brain wants to dismiss it all, to say it was a bear or our imaginations running wild in the darkness. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Those footprints were real. That scream was real. That figure watching us from behind the tree was real. Glen Gowen has been in my family for 3 generations, and for 3 generations something has been watching us there. Something that walks on 2 legs but isn't human. Something that screams in the night and can push open a heavy wooden door with ease. I don't know if I'll ever go back. Part of me wants to, armed with better cameras and recording equipment. But another part of me remembers the fear I felt that night. Listening to those heavy footsteps outside the cabin, feeling the floor vibrate as something tried to force its way in. Whatever lives in the wilderness around Glen Gowen has been there since before my grandfather's time. It was there when Thomas Gowen built his mining camp, and based on our experience last summer, it's still there, watching and waiting in the shadow of the mountains. I'm sharing this now because I need someone else to know, because sometimes at night I still wake up hearing that scream echoing in my head. Because the next time someone disappears in the Mazatzal wilderness, I want there to be a record of what's out there. And if you ever find yourself hiking in remote parts of Arizona and the forest suddenly goes quiet, if you feel eyes watching you from the tree line, if you hear a scream that raises the hair on the back of your neck, remember this story. Turn around. Go back. Some places in the wilderness aren't meant for us. Story 2. I'm still trying to make sense of what I saw last August. It's been 8 months now, but I keep replaying those few seconds over and over in my mind, questioning if what I saw was real. I know what I saw, but saying it out loud still feels ridiculous. I've always been the skeptical type. The kind of person who needs proof, who looks for the logical explanation first. That's partly why I became a wildlife photographer. I wanted to document what really exists in our world, not what people imagine. So here goes. On August 22nd, 2013, I had an encounter that I can't explain. I haven't told many people about this, but I need to get it out. Maybe someone here has seen something similar. I'd been planning a photography trip to Canyon de Chelly in northeastern Arizona for months. The area is known for its incredible landscapes and diverse wildlife, perfect for the photo series I was working on about desert ecosystems. I'd spent the day scouting locations and taking test shots, but nothing spectacular. As the sun started to set, I decided to find a good campsite before it got completely dark. My Jeep bumped along Dirt Road 7 on the south side of the canyon. It's a rough, unpaved road that winds through some pretty isolated territory, I was going slow, maybe 20 miles per hour, both because of the terrible road conditions and because I was scanning for a flat area to set up camp. The dust from the road hung in the air, catching the last bits of sunlight in this weird orange glow. By around 8:30, dusk had really settled in. That time of day when everything starts to look different, when shadows play tricks on you. The temperature was dropping quickly, typical desert night. I had my windows down, feeling that transition from the day's heat to the cool night air. I remember smelling juniper and dust. I wasn't particularly nervous being out there alone. I'd done solo camping trips dozens of times before. I had all my gear, tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water for a few days, my cameras safely packed in their waterproof cases. My plan was to wake up early and catch the sunrise light on the canyon walls. As the darkness grew deeper, I switched on my headlights. They only illuminated about 40 feet ahead on that uneven road. I was still driving slowly, keeping my eyes peeled for a good spot to pull over. The headlights created this tunnel-like view ahead, with everything else around me just black void. That's when it happened. From the left side of the road, about 40 feet ahead of me, something stepped into the edge of my headlight beams. At first, my brain tried to categorize it. Deer? No, too upright. Bear? No, the movement was wrong. Within a split second, I realized I was looking at something I couldn't identify. This figure, this being, moved with purpose across the road. Not running, not scurrying, but walking with deliberate steps. It was angling slightly away from my Jeep as it crossed. The movement was smooth, almost graceful, not the awkward lope of a bear or the bounce of a deer. It was bipedal, upright, and moved like it knew exactly where it was going. I instinctively eased off the gas, slowing even more. My heart was suddenly pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white. Time seemed to stretch out, but the whole thing probably lasted only 3 or 4 seconds. The creature reached the opposite side of the road, just a few feet ahead of my now crawling Jeep. When it got to the shallow ditch on the far side, it bent down behind a bush like it was trying to hide. It never turned toward me. Not once did I see its face. It remained facing away the entire time, which somehow made the encounter even more unsettling. But I saw enough. In the harsh white of my headlights, I could clearly see a uniformly dark brown, hair-covered body. Not fur like a bear. Hair, longer and more uniform, covering its entire body. It stood around 6 feet tall, with a solid build. Not skinny, not massive, but solid muscle. The way it moved showed strength and agility. I've photographed countless wild animals. I know how they move. This wasn't like anything I'd documented before. The proportions were wrong for any animal native to that area. The arms were long, hanging down past where knees would be. The shoulders were broad, tapering to a narrower waist. The head sat directly on those shoulders, with barely any visible neck. After it disappeared behind the bush, I sat there frozen for maybe 30 seconds. My mind was racing, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Should I stop and investigate? Should I keep driving? What if it came back? What if there were more of them? I chose to keep moving. I hit the gas and drove north as quickly as the rough road would allow, eventually connecting with the paved road that led to the canyon's edge. My hands were shaking on the wheel. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see something following me. I drove about 3 miles before pulling off into a wooded area, far enough from the main road to be inconspicuous, but not so deep into the wilderness that I'd be completely isolated. There was no way I was setting up a tent that night. I rearranged my gear inside the Jeep to make space in the back, locked all the doors, and tried to settle in for the night. But sleep was impossible. Every sound outside, the wind in the trees, nocturnal animals moving about, branches creaking, made me jolt upright. I kept the keys in the ignition, ready to drive away at a moment's notice. I've spent countless nights in remote wilderness areas, and I've never felt that level of unease before. It wasn't just fear of the unknown creature. It was this overwhelming sense that I was being watched, that I had crossed into a territory where I wasn't supposed to be. I kept replaying those few seconds in my mind, trying to convince myself that it was just a bear or some other known animal caught in an odd posture by my headlights. But I knew better. The fluid bipedal movement, the deliberate hiding, the proportions, none of it matched any animal I was familiar with. As the night wore on, I heard what sounded like wood knocking in the distance. 3 distinct knocks, then silence, then 3 more a few minutes later. At around 2 in the morning, a howl echoed through the canyon. Not a coyote or a wolf, but something deeper, longer, with an almost human-like quality to it. It raised the hair on the back of my neck. I convinced myself it was just the wind, just my imagination working overtime because of what I thought I'd seen. When the first light of dawn finally came, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Darkness plays tricks on the mind. I told myself that in the light of day, I'd go back to the crossing site and find a rational explanation. After a quick breakfast of granola bars and lukewarm coffee from my thermos, I drove back to where I'd seen the creature. The spot looked so ordinary in daylight, just a section of dirt road cutting through scrubby desert vegetation. I parked and got out, camera in hand, not entirely sure what I was looking for. The ground was hard-packed dirt, not great for tracking. I searched for footprints, but found nothing conclusive, just some scuffs and indentations that could have been made by anything. I checked the bush where it had hidden, looking for hair or any other evidence. Nothing. I expanded my search, looking for broken branches, disturbed vegetation, anything that might confirm what I'd seen. Again, nothing definitive. I spent about 2 hours combing the area, photographing anything that seemed even slightly unusual. A few times I thought I heard movement in the underbrush farther from the road, but when I investigated, I found nothing. Just the desert going about its day, lizards basking on rocks, birds calling to each other, insects buzzing in the increasing heat. I decided to continue with my planned photography trip, though I stayed away from that particular stretch of road. For the next 3 days, I photographed the canyon, the flora, the small wildlife. I slept in my car each night, never quite comfortable enough to set up my tent. I didn't see the creature again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed from a distance. When I got home, I developed my photos and scrutinized the ones I'd taken at the crossing site. Nothing unusual appeared in any of them. I researched wildlife in the Canyon de Chelly area, looking for anything that might explain what I'd seen. Black bears do live in Arizona, but they don't move the way this creature did. No other known animal in the region matches what I saw. That's when I reluctantly began researching Bigfoot and Sasquatch sightings. I've always dismissed those stories as misidentifications or hoaxes. I'm still not entirely comfortable putting my experience in that category, but I don't know how else to classify it. I found reports of similar sightings in that region dating back decades. Native American legends speak of hairy men of the woods. Modern accounts describe creatures matching what I saw. The height, the coloring, the movement patterns. Some reports mention wood knocking and strange howls, just like what I heard that night. I've gone back and forth countless times. Maybe it was just a bear walking oddly. Maybe the twilight conditions and my tiredness created an optical illusion. Maybe my mind filled in details that weren't really there. But then I remember the way it moved, so purposeful, so aware, the way it deliberately concealed itself, the proportions that didn't match any known animal. 8 months later, I still haven't told many people about this. My closest friends would think I've lost it. The scientific community would dismiss it without physical evidence, so I keep it mostly to myself, turning it over in my mind, questioning my own experience. I'm a photographer because I believe in documenting reality, in showing the world as it actually is. But now I find myself questioning what reality actually contains. Are there things moving through our wilderness that we've failed to document, failed to acknowledge? Things that exist on the edges of our civilization, that know how to stay hidden, that have perhaps been there all along? I don't have answers. Just the memory of those few seconds, a dark figure crossing the road, moving with intelligence and purpose, disappearing into the wilderness. And the unsettling feeling that something out there in Canyon de Delli knows I saw it, while I'm still struggling to understand exactly what it was that I witnessed. I still go on photography trips, but I don't camp alone anymore. And whenever I'm in remote areas, I find myself scanning the tree line, watching for movement, listening for wood knocks in the night. Not out of fear exactly, but out of a new awareness that the natural world might contain more than I previously believed. If anyone has had similar experiences in that area, I'd really like to know. I'm not looking for people to validate my experience or tell me I'm crazy. I just want to understand what crossed that road in front of me that August evening, and why the memory of those few seconds continues to haunt me 8 months later. Udesnut Story 3, Numuchul. I still have a hard time talking about what happened that day. 26 years later, and my hands still shake when I think about it. Some nights, I wake up in a cold sweat, that smell still fresh in my nostrils, like it happened yesterday. But I need to get this out. Maybe someone here has seen something similar. It was mid-October of 1994, peak deer season in northeastern Arizona. I was 20 years old and had been hunting those mountains since I was 14, first with my dad and uncles, then on my own when I got older. The Lucachikai Mountains were practically my second home. I knew every trail, every ridge, every seasonal water source. At least, I thought I did. That morning, October 15th, was bone-chillingly cold, the kind that seeps into your marrow. There had been a light drizzle the night before, and everything had frozen over by dawn. My cousins Delbert and James had driven up from Window Rock to hunt with me for the weekend. We'd camped at the base of the mountain and woke up around 4:30 that morning. The plan was to be at our hunting spots before sunrise. We drove my old pickup as far up the Forest Service road as we could, then hiked the rest of the way to the ridge. The fog was thick that morning, hanging between the pines like smoke. Visibility was maybe 30 yards in the open areas, less in the trees. Our breath came out in thick white clouds, and the frozen ground crunched under our boots. I remember thinking how unnaturally quiet everything was. No birds, no wind, just the sound of our footsteps breaking through the frost. We reached the top of the ridge around 7 in the morning. The sun was just starting to burn off some of the fog, but the forest still felt smothered in it. The three of us had a quick strategy talk at the trailhead. Delbert and James wanted to take the main trail that followed the ridgeline toward a saddle about a mile northwest. It was a good spot where deer often crossed. I suggested a slightly different approach. I'd cut directly over the hill to the north and work my way around to meet them at the saddle from the other side. That way, if they spooked anything, it might run toward me. I can't stop thinking about how different things would have been if I'd just stayed with them. I shouldered my .30-06 rifle and started up the hill. It wasn't particularly steep, but the frozen ground made the footing tricky. I moved slowly, scanning ahead for any movement, any flash of brown that might be a deer. About 15 minutes in, I reached the crest of the hill. The fog had started to lift a bit, giving me maybe 50 or 60 yards of visibility. I stopped to catch my breath and get my bearings. I figured my cousins should be somewhere off to my right, so I called out, not too loud, just enough that they might hear me if they were close. No answer. I waited a minute, then called again. That's when I heard it. There was movement in the oak brush about 40 or 50 yards downhill to my left, not the light, careful steps of a deer. This was heavy, deliberate. Something big was moving through that brush. I raised my rifle and peered through the scope, thinking maybe it was an elk. We didn't have a tag for elk, but I wanted to see it anyway. What I saw instead has haunted me for over 2 decades. Through the scope, I could make out a large, dark figure moving through the brush, walking upright, on 2 legs. The oak brush in that area typically grows about 5 to 6 feet tall, and this thing, the brush was only reaching its armpits. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, like a linebacker, but bigger, much bigger. I lowered my rifle slightly, thinking maybe it was another hunter. But no hunter I've ever seen moves like that or looks like that. Its arms swung with a fluid, powerful motion that seemed both natural and completely alien at the same time. And the hair, coarse black hair, covered its entire body. The smell hit me next, even from that distance, upwind as I was. A powerful, musky stench like wet, dirty animal fur mixed with something else. Something rotten. I've field-dressed countless deer and elk. I've been around farm animals my whole life. This smell was nothing like that. It was distinct and overwhelming, making my eyes water and my stomach turn. I kept the creature in my scope as it moved steadily downhill. It never hesitated, never looked around, just deliberate, powerful strides through brush that would have made most men struggle. It was heading toward a game trail about 70 yards below my position. I had a clear shot, the clearest shot I'd ever had hunting, but my finger wouldn't move to the trigger. This is going to sound strange, but something about the way it moved. It was too human. Not human exactly, but intelligent, purposeful. I couldn't shoot at something that walked like that, no matter how much it resembled an animal in other ways. The creature reached the game trail and turned northwest, in the same general direction my cousins had gone. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. It disappeared into the trees within seconds, the brush barely moving as it passed, like it knew how to move silently despite its size. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or 2. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I needed to find my cousins. Now. I abandoned my planned route and started moving quickly north, toward the forest road we'd driven in on. I figured I could follow it back to the main trail and catch up with them. I wasn't thinking clearly. Part of me just wanted to get back to the truck and leave. But I couldn't abandon my cousins out there. I'd gone maybe a quarter mile when I heard movement in the oak brush to my right. Not the same heavy footfalls as before, but something deliberately trying to move quietly. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't see anything through the brush, but I felt watched. I raised my rifle and fired a shot into the air. The sound was deafening in the quiet forest. I wasn't trying to hit anything, just scare it off, whatever it was. I chambered another round and kept walking, faster now, almost jogging. The next half hour was the longest of my life. Every shadow in the forest seemed to move. Every sound made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced something was following me just out of sight. The smell would come and go, that same musky, foul odor, but I never saw anything clearly. I finally reached the main trail and practically ran down it toward the saddle where my cousins should be. I found them about 20 minutes later, sitting on a fallen log, eating jerky and looking bored. "Where the hell have you been?" Delbert asked. "We've been waiting for an hour." I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words sounded ridiculous even to me. A giant, hair-covered man-thing walking through the forest. They thought I was joking at first, then that I was trying to scare them. It wasn't until they realized how badly my hands were shaking that they started to take me seriously. "Maybe it was a bear," James suggested. "They can stand on their hind legs, but I'd seen plenty of bears. This wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk upright for hundreds of yards. They don't have shoulders like linebackers or swing their arms like humans. And they don't move through dense brush without making a sound." We stayed together the rest of that day. Didn't see a single deer, which was unusual for that spot. The forest felt emptier than I'd ever known it to be. No squirrels, no birds, like everything had cleared out. We left before dusk, None of us wanted to be on that mountain after dark. For years, I didn't talk about what happened. Who would believe me? But I started doing research, searching for similar stories. I found out I wasn't the first Navajo to see something like this in the Lucachikai Mountains. There are stories going back generations about tall, hairy beings in the remote areas. Some of the elders call them Yeshiyitso, though that term gets used for several different creatures in our stories. What bothers me most, even now, isn't just that I saw something impossible. It's that I'm convinced it knew exactly what I was. The deliberate way it moved, how it possibly followed me afterward. There was an intelligence there that I can't explain, like it was studying me as much as I was studying it. I've been back to those mountains many times since then. I still hunt, still hike the same areas, but never alone, and never without looking over my shoulder. The worst part? Sometimes when I'm out there, I get that same feeling of being watched, and that smell, that distinctive musky odor, will suddenly be there, even when the wind is blowing the wrong direction for it to carry from anywhere logical. Whatever I saw that day, I think it's still out there. And I think it remembers me too. I don't have any photos or proof. Just what I saw with my own eyes. But I know what I encountered was real. It was something that shouldn't exist according to science, but it does. And it's smart enough to have avoided clear documentation all these years. Has anyone else experienced something similar in the Lucachikai area? Or anywhere in the Four Corners region? I'm not looking for people to validate my experience. I know what I saw. I'm just wondering how many others have encountered these beings and stayed silent out of fear of ridicule. I still dream about those few moments when I had it in my scope. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd pulled the trigger, but mostly I'm glad I didn't. Whatever that creature was, it felt too aware to justify shooting at it. And sometimes, in my darkest thoughts, I wonder if it spared me that day for the same reason. See Story 4. Last week, I finally told my sister about what happened all those years ago, and she suggested I post about it online to see if anyone else has had similar experiences. I've kept this quiet for so long, but it's been 26 years now, and I still think about it almost daily. My daughter, Sophia, and I saw something that summer morning in 1997 that I still can't explain. And honestly, I'm tired of people telling me I'm crazy. It was early June, probably around the 5th or 6th. Funny how some details stick while others fade. Sophia had just finished her sophomore year of college, and we were driving to visit my sister in Portland. We'd left our home in Klamath Falls before dawn to beat the heat. I've always been an early riser, and Sophia had reluctantly agreed to the 4:30 a.m. departure time. We'd been on the road for about 2 hours, and the sun had just fully risen, lighting up everything with that clean, crisp morning light. We were somewhere near Oak Ridge, taking the scenic route through the countryside rather than the main highway. I've always preferred the back roads, less traffic, prettier views, and I feel more connected to the journey. It was just after 6:30 a.m., and we were on this stretch of road that cut through rolling farmland and patches of forest. The weather was perfect. Clear blue skies, probably about 65 degrees, with a light breeze that rustled the grass in the fields as we drove by. Sophia had been dozing on and off, but she was awake at this point. We were chatting about her plans for the summer. She'd lined up an internship at a law firm in Portland and was staying with my sister for the 3 months. I remember turning down the radio because I wanted to hear about her roommate situation for the following year. I was driving around 45 miles per hour. The road wasn't particularly winding, just gentle curves through the countryside with good visibility. Traffic was basically non-existent. We'd passed maybe 2 cars in the last half hour. I felt relaxed, enjoying the quiet morning with my daughter. That's when I spotted it. About 100 yards ahead, in a field to the right of the road. At first, my brain registered it as something mundane. A piece of farm equipment maybe, or a large rock. But as we got closer, I realized it was moving, just slightly, but definitely moving. "Do you see that?" I asked Sophia, slowing down slightly. She leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. "What is that? Is it a person?" It wasn't a person, at least not a normal person. As we got closer, maybe 50 yards away, I could see it clearly. It was sitting in the field about 20 feet from the edge of the road. The field was planted with something low-growing, alfalfa, I think, so there wasn't anything obscuring our view. No trees, no tall crops, nothing but this thing sitting there in plain sight. It was sitting with its back to the road, legs stretched out in front of it, but everything about its proportions was wrong. It was covered in brown hair. Not fur exactly, but hair. It wasn't shaggy like a bear, but more uniform, almost like a well-kept coat. The color was a rich chocolate brown, darker in some places than others. Its shoulders were impossibly wide. I remember thinking they must have been at least twice as broad as my ex-husband's, who was a big man. The head was strange. It didn't have the distinct separation from the shoulders that people have. Instead, it seemed to slope directly into the shoulders, like there was barely any neck at all. The head itself was shaped oddly too, kind of oblong and tapered toward the top. But the arms, God, the arms were what really struck me. They were impossibly long, extending down alongside its body. Even though it was sitting upright, its hands were resting flat on the ground. No human has arms that long. It's anatomically impossible. "Mum, slow down," Sophia whispered, gripping the dashboard. Her face had gone completely white. I did slow down a bit more, but something deep inside me was screaming not to stop. Looking back, I think it was pure instinct, the way you know not to approach a snake or stick your hand in a fire. Every cell in my body was telling me to keep moving. "It's not a bear," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant even to myself. "Bears don't sit like that." "What is it?" Sophia's voice was barely audible. I didn't answer because I didn't have an answer, but we both knew what it looked like. It looked like a Sasquatch, a Bigfoot, one of those creatures from cheesy documentaries and blurry photos. Except this wasn't blurry. This wasn't a documentary. This was real life, in broad daylight, on a beautiful summer morning. As we drove past, now directly adjacent to it, I glanced in my side view mirror. I swear it turned its head just slightly in our direction. I didn't see its face, thank God, but the movement was unmistakable. It knew we were there. It was aware of us. "Did you see that?" Sophia's voice was higher now, edged with panic. "It moved, Mom. It turned to look at us." "I know," I said, pressing the gas pedal a little harder. The car accelerated, and I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, fighting the urge to look back again. We drove in complete silence for the next 10 minutes. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I could hear Sophia's rapid breathing beside me. Finally, I pulled into a small gas station in the next town. I don't even remember which one it was. We sat in the parking lot for a long time, neither of us making a move to get out of the car. "What was that?" Sophia finally asked. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "But we both saw it." "It wasn't human," she said. "It wasn't a question." "No," I agreed. "It wasn't." We debated whether to tell anyone, to report it somewhere, but who would we tell? The police? They'd think we were crazy. Forest Service? Same thing. And what would we even say? That we saw a Sasquatch sitting in a field like it was having a morning rest. We decided to continue to Portland, but take the main highway for the rest of the trip. Neither of us wanted to go back the way we came. When we got to my sister's house, we tried to act normal. But that evening, when we were alone, Sophia and I sat down and wrote everything we could remember about what we'd seen. We drew pictures too, though neither of us is particularly artistic. We wanted to document it while it was fresh in our minds. Over the next few days, we tried to talk ourselves out of what we'd seen. Maybe it was a man in a costume. But who would sit in a field at 6:30 in the morning wearing a gorilla suit? And the proportions were all wrong. Those arms were too long for any costume I've ever seen. Maybe it was a bear with mange or some other condition. But bears don't sit like that, with their legs stretched out in front of them. And the shape of the head and shoulders was nothing like a bear. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion. A tree stump or large rock that just happened to look like a humanoid figure. But it moved. We both saw it move. A week after our encounter, Sophia and I drove back to Klamath Falls. We deliberately took the main highway, avoiding the back roads where we'd seen the creature. We didn't talk about it much during that summer, but I know it affected Sophia deeply. She used to love hiking and camping, but after that incident, she became reluctant to go into wooded areas. She'd make excuses about allergies or homework, but I knew the real reason. As for me, I started researching. I went to the library and checked out books on cryptozoology and unexplained phenomena. I read accounts from other people who claimed to have seen similar creatures. Some of them resonated with me. The descriptions of the broad shoulders, the elongated arms, the sloping neck. Others seemed like obvious hoaxes or misidentifications. I never became what you'd call a believer. I didn't join any Sasquatch hunting groups or go to conventions. But I couldn't be a complete skeptic anymore either. I'd seen something with my own eyes that defied conventional explanation. About a month after our sighting, I got up the courage to drive back to that area alone. I know it was stupid and potentially dangerous, but I needed to see the location again. I wanted to take pictures, to look for any signs that might explain what we'd seen. I found what I believed was the same stretch of road, the same field. It looked so ordinary in the afternoon light, just a field like any other. I pulled over and got out of the car, scanning the area where I thought the creature had been sitting. There was nothing unusual to see. No giant footprints, no tufts of brown hair caught on the fence posts, no physical evidence at all. Part of me was relieved, but another part was frustrated. Without proof, our experience would always be just a story, easily dismissed by others. Over the years, I've told a few people about what happened. My second husband, a close friend who was interested in unexplained phenomena, a therapist I saw briefly after my divorce. The reactions have been predictable: polite skepticism, suggestions of misidentification, sometimes outright disbelief. It must have been a bear. Maybe it was someone playing a prank. Our minds can play tricks on us, especially early in the morning. The only person who never questioned me was Sophia. She saw it too, after all. We don't talk about it much anymore, but occasionally when we're alone, one of us will reference that morning, and the other will nod, understanding completely. Last year, Sophia and her husband moved to Seattle with my grandchildren. When they drive down to visit, they always take the main highway. She's never said why, and I've never asked, but I know. Some roads you just don't want to travel again. I've thought a lot about why that creature was there, sitting in that field that morning. Was it resting, watching for something? Had it been traveling through the forest and stopped for a break in the open field? Did it live nearby? Were there others? I think what haunts me most is how ordinary the moment was until it wasn't. One second, we were just a mother and daughter on a road trip, chatting about college and summer plans. The next, our understanding of the world had fundamentally shifted. Something impossible was possible. Something that shouldn't exist did exist, right there in the golden morning light of rural Oregon. I'm 64 now, and I've never seen anything like it again. I haven't gone looking for it either. That one glimpse was enough to convince me that there are things in this world that defy explanation. Things that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we think we know. Sometimes, when I'm driving through a rural area early in the morning, I find myself scanning the fields and forest edges, half expecting to see that broad, hair-covered back again. I never have, and honestly, I'm not sure if I'm relieved or disappointed. What I am sure of is what Sophia and I saw that morning in 1997. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a man, it wasn't a trick of the light or a figment of our imagination. It was something else entirely, something that shouldn't have been there, but was. And sometimes, in my dreams, I see it turn its head fully toward our car as we drive past. In these dreams, I can see its face, but when I wake up, I can never remember what it looked like. Maybe that's a mercy. Some things, perhaps, we're not meant to see clearly, only to glimpse from the corner of our eye as we pass by, too afraid to stop, too curious to look away completely. I don't know if anyone else has ever seen what we saw that morning. I don't know if anyone would believe us if we tried to explain it in more detail, but I know what I saw. Sophia knows what she saw. And whatever it was, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, or something else entirely, it was real. As real as the road we were driving on, as real as the sun rising over the fields, as real as the fear that still occasionally wakes me in the middle of the night. I'd give anything to go back to that morning with a camera, to have proof beyond our memories. But maybe it's better this way. Some mysteries should perhaps remain mysteries. Some creatures should remain glimpsed but never captured. If what we saw was truly a Sasquatch, maybe it survived this long precisely because encounters like ours end with nothing more than a story, easily dismissed, impossible to prove. But we know what we saw, and now, so do you. Story 5. I've never told this story to many people outside my family. It's been 40 years now, but I still get goosebumps thinking about that summer day in 1983. I was 8 years old, just a kid excited about our camping trip to Miners Creek in Holden, Washington. It was supposed to be a normal vacation, swimming, fishing, making s'mores, all that typical stuff families do. But what happened that day changed me forever. It was late July, blazing hot, probably in the 90s. Mom and Dad were setting up our campsite with the other adults. Lawn chairs, coolers, and that giant blue tent Dad always complained about putting together. My friend Tyler was there with his parents too. Our families had been friends forever, and we always went on these summer camping trips together. "Come on, Caleb," Tyler shouted, already halfway down the trail toward the creek. "Last one, there's a rotten egg." He was 9, a year older than me, always acting like he was in charge. Mom yelled after us to stay within shouting distance, and we promised we would. The adults were busy hammering tent stakes and organizing supplies, so they were happy to have us out of their hair for a bit. The path down to Miners Creek was steep in spots, with exposed tree roots that worked like natural steps. I remember the smell of pine needles baking in the sun and the buzzing of insects around us. It was the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the ground. We found this perfect sandbar about 200 yards downstream from our campsite. The creek was running clear and cold from the mountain snowmelt, creating that constant rushing sound that drowns out everything else. The water was freezing despite the hot day, that kind of mountain cold that makes your bones ache. "Bet I can skip a rock farther than you," Tyler challenged, already searching the shore for the perfect flat stone. "No way," I shot back, though he usually could. He had this technique his dad taught him, where he'd flick his wrist just right. We spent what felt like forever skipping stones, splashing around in the shallows, and building little rock dams along the edge of the stream. The sun glanced through the trees, creating these dancing patterns on the water. It was peaceful, normal, until it wasn't. I was bent down, searching for another good skipping stone, when something caught my eye across the creek. At first it was just movement, a shadow shifting between the trees on the opposite bank. I straightened up, squinting against the sunlight. "Tyler," I said quietly, not taking my eyes off what I was seeing. "Look over there." "Where?" He was still focused on finding the perfect rock. "Across the creek, by that big fallen tree." I pointed, keeping my arm low. Through the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees, I could see someone or something moving along the opposite bank. My first thought was that it was a person wearing a fur coat, which made no sense at all given how hot it was. "Who'd wear a coat on a day like this?" I whispered to Tyler, who was finally looking where I was pointing. The figure was walking carefully along the rocky creek bed, stepping from boulder to boulder. It seemed to be examining the water's edge, like it was searching for something. The way it moved was strange, deliberate, but fluid, not clumsy like you'd expect someone to be when navigating slippery creek rocks. "Is that a bear?" Tyler whispered, his voice cracking a little. But I knew it wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk like that. This thing was upright the whole time, and the movements were too precise. It had long arms that swung naturally at its sides as it moved. "I don't think so," I replied, my heart starting to pound in my chest. "It's walking funny." We stood frozen, watching as this creature continued moving upstream, picking its path along the creek with impossible grace for something so large, because it was large, not just tall but broad, solid. The fur I thought I saw initially wasn't a coat at all. It was covering its entire body. "We should get Dad," I said, finally breaking the spell. "And your dad too." Tyler nodded, his eyes wide. Yeah, we should." We both started backing away slowly, never taking our eyes off the figure across the creek. Then, once we felt we were far enough away, we turned and ran as fast as our legs would carry us back up the trail toward the campsite. "Dad! Dad!" I was shouting before we even reached the clearing. "There's something at the creek!" My father, Marcus, was hammering in the last tent stake. He looked up, alarmed at my tone. "What is it, Caleb? Are you hurt?" "There's something down by the creek," I panted, pointing back the way we'd come. "It looks like a person, but not a person." "A bear?" Tyler's dad asked, already reaching for the bear spray they kept in their camping gear. "It's not a bear," Tyler insisted. "It's walking on two legs, the whole time." Dad exchanged glances with the other adults. I could see the concern, but also the skepticism. Kids with overactive imaginations and all that. "Show me," Dad said finally, reaching for his backpack. He pulled out the binoculars he always brought for bird watching. "But stay behind me." Nearly all the adults came with us. My dad, Tyler's parents, and my Uncle Pete, who was a hunter. Mum stayed behind with my little sister, who was napping in the car. We moved quickly but quietly back down to the creek, following our earlier path. "There," I whispered, pointing across the water when we reached the sandbar. "By that big boulder." The creature was still there, still examining the creek bed methodically. It hadn't moved far from where we'd first spotted it. In the time we'd been gone, it had crouched down and appeared to be sifting through the water with its hands, or what I assumed were hands. Dad raised the binoculars to his eyes, adjusting the focus. I watched his face, saw his expression change from doubtful to something I couldn't quite name. Confusion, concern, fear, maybe all three. "That's not moving like a bear," he said quietly, his voice tight. He passed the binoculars to Tyler's dad. "Too big for a person," came the reply after a moment of silent observation. The adults passed the binoculars around, each taking turns looking. Nobody spoke much louder than a whisper, as if we all instinctively knew we shouldn't draw attention to ourselves. Uncle Pete was the last to look. He was the outdoorsman among us, having spent his life hunting and fishing in these mountains. If anyone would know what we were looking at, it would be him. "I've never seen anything like it," he admitted, lowering the binoculars. "That's no known animal species I've ever encountered." I remember feeling validated, but also terrified by his words. If Uncle Pete didn't know what it was, then what were we looking at? I took another look at our surroundings, realizing just how isolated this spot was. We were at a bend in Miners Creek, west of the old Holden mine, with a large scree slope on the opposite side where the creature was. The terrain over there was rough, no trails, no easy access, just wilderness stretching toward the distant mountains. "Should we—" Tyler's mom hesitated. Should we try to get its attention? I don't think that's wise, Uncle Pete cautioned, but Dad was already cupping his hands around his mouth. "Hey!" he shouted across the water. "Hello over there!" Nothing. The creature continued its examination of the creek bed, seemingly oblivious to our presence. The rushing water was loud, probably too loud for our voices to carry over it. Dad tried again, louder this time. The other adults joined in, calling and waving their arms. I remember feeling a creeping dread, not wanting the thing to notice us, but also desperate to understand what we were seeing. Then it happened. The creature straightened up to its full height, which was considerable, and turned its head toward us. I couldn't make out facial features from that distance, but I could feel it looking at us, studying us. Time seemed to stretch and compress all at once. It might have been seconds or minutes that we stood there, locked in this strange, silent standoff across the creek. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then, with a deliberateness that sent chills through me, the creature turned and began walking away. Not running, not scrambling in fear like an animal might, just calmly walking back upstream, its long arms swinging at its sides, its gait smooth and powerful. "It's leaving," Tyler whispered, as if afraid it might change its mind if he spoke too loudly. We watched until it disappeared into the tree line, moving with that same fluid motion that seemed impossible for its size. The adults kept the binoculars trained on it until there was nothing left to see. The silence that followed was heavy. Nobody seemed to know what to say. What had we just witnessed? What was that thing? "We should head back to camp," Dad finally said, his voice strained. "It'll be getting dark soon." On the walk back, the adults spoke in hushed tones, just out of earshot. Tyler and I trailed behind them, trying to process what we'd seen. "Do you think it was Bigfoot?" Tyler asked, his voice a mixture of fear and excitement. I shrugged, not wanting to admit how scared I felt. "I don't know, maybe." When we got back to camp, the adults had a long discussion while preparing dinner. They debated reporting what we'd seen to the ranger station, but ultimately decided against it. Who would believe them? What proof did we have? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves outside our tent sent my imagination racing. What if it followed us back to camp? What if it was watching us right now? The next morning, Uncle Pete and Dad hiked back down to the creek and crossed over at a shallow point upstream. They spent hours searching the area where we'd seen the creature, looking for tracks or evidence. They found some unusual impressions in the soft earth near the water's edge. Large, elongated depressions that might have been footprints. But the rocky terrain didn't hold prints well, and whatever marks they found were inconclusive. We cut our camping trip short, packing up that afternoon instead of staying the full week we'd planned. Nobody explicitly said it was because of what we'd seen, but I knew. We all knew. For years afterward, I questioned what we'd seen that day. As I got older, I researched Bigfoot sightings online, read books about cryptids, and even joined forums where people shared similar experiences. The creature's appearance, behavior, and method of travel matched many Sasquatch sightings reported across the Pacific Northwest. What strikes me most, even now, was how it acted. It wasn't aggressive or threatening. It seemed more curious, methodical, intelligent. It was examining the creek like it was looking for something specific, maybe food, maybe materials. When it noticed us watching, it simply decided to leave. No drama, no confrontation, just a calm retreat into wilderness too rugged for casual exploration. I've returned to Miners Creek a few times as an adult. The area has changed some, more visitors, better maintained trails, but that bend in the creek still looks largely the same. Each time I've gone back, I've found myself scanning the opposite bank, half expecting, half hoping to catch another glimpse of whatever it was we saw that day. Tyler and I don't talk much anymore. Life took us in different directions after high school, but every few years he'll text me out of the blue with just 3 words. Remember Miners Creek? And I always respond the same way. Every day. I still don't know what we saw that summer day in 1983. But I know what we didn't see. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a person in a costume, and it wasn't a figment of our collective imagination. It was something else. Something that shouldn't exist according to science, but was undeniably real to everyone who stood on that sandbar. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, still carefully picking its way along creek beds in the wilderness, still retreating when spotted by humans. And sometimes, on nights when I can't sleep, and the world feels too small and too known, I find comfort in the possibility that there are still mysteries in these woods, things that exist beyond our understanding, living quiet lives just out of sight. What keeps me up at night isn't fear that the creature might have harmed us. It's the realization that it chose not to engage with us at all, like we were the intruders in its world, not the other way around, and maybe we were. Story 6. I've been hesitant to share this for nearly 30 years now. When you experience something that defies explanation, something that challenges everything you thought you knew about the world around you, it's hard to find the words. I've been a bow hunter since I was 15, spent more time in the forests of the Pacific Northwest than most park rangers, and until September of 1993, I thought I understood the wilderness and its inhabitants. I was 47 then, had my routine down to a science. That particular morning started like any other early fall hunt. My buddies Mike and Dave had set up about 2 miles south of my position. We'd been coming to this same stretch of national forest for over a decade, knew it like the back of our hands. At least, I thought I did. I remember checking my watch as I parked my truck at the trailhead, 5:15 in the morning. Perfect timing. The air had that crisp September feel, not quite cold, but with enough bite to make you grateful for a good jacket. I gathered my gear methodically, bow, quiver, small pack with essentials, my trusty rangefinder. The weight of it all felt reassuring, familiar. The hike-in took about an hour. I'd chosen to work a ridgeline that morning, one that gave good visibility down into a draw where I'd spotted several nice bucks the previous season. The trail was narrow but well-defined, probably originally made by deer and widened by the occasional hunter or hiker. By 6:30 I was in position, moving slowly, deliberately, scanning the forest floor for fresh sign. It was around 7 when things started to feel different. I can't really explain it any other way. The forest seemed to shift. At first I thought it was just my senses heightening as they always do during a hunt, that hyper-awareness that develops when you're fully tuned into your surroundings. But this was something else. The birds had stopped singing. I remember that distinctly because I'd been using their morning chatter to cover the soft sound of my footsteps. The silence was sudden, complete, not gradual like when a hawk passes overhead. Everything just stopped. Then came the feeling of being watched. Every hunter knows that sensation. We've all experienced those moments when you realize a deer is staring at you from somewhere in the brush. This was different, more intense. The hairs on my arms stood up despite the warmth of my jacket. I continued down the trail, but more cautiously now. Every 20 yards or so I'd stop completely, spending several minutes listening, looking, trying to identify what had triggered my unease. Nothing. Just silence and that persistent feeling of eyes on me. After about 20 minutes of this slow progression, I stopped at a small clearing to glass the slope below me. Still nothing unusual visible, but my stomach was in knots. I've faced down bears at close range, had cougars trail me, even got lost once in a snowstorm. Never felt anything like this. I took a deep breath and decided to keep moving. I remember thinking that maybe I'd spooked a bear, and it was shadowing me, curious but keeping its distance, I remember adjusting my bow in my hand, making sure an arrow was nocked and ready. Not out of fear, really, just caution. Then I looked back down the trail behind me. That's when I saw it. About 100 yards back, a large figure was walking up the same trail I'd just traversed, walking upright, walking purposefully, walking like a man, but not a man. My first thought, absurdly, was that another hunter had followed me in. But I knew instantly that wasn't right. The size was all wrong, too big, too broad. The movement was fluid but powerful. It was covered in what appeared to be dark hair or fur, not a jacket, not clothing, and it was moving fast, eating up the distance between us with long strides. For several seconds, maybe 6 or 8, I just stood there, frozen, watching this being approach. My mind was racing, trying to categorize what I was seeing. Bear? No, completely wrong posture. Man? No human I'd ever seen moved like that or had that build. The surreality of the moment was overwhelming. When it got to maybe 70 or 80 yards away, it suddenly stopped. I could feel it looking directly at me, though I couldn't make out distinct facial features at that distance in the early morning forest light. Then, with deliberate purpose, it turned left off the trail and disappeared over the adjacent ridge. The entire encounter lasted less than 10 seconds. 10 seconds that changed everything I thought I knew. My heart was hammering in my chest. But strangely, I wasn't exactly afraid. Unsettled, yes. Confused, definitely. But my overwhelming emotion was curiosity. I had to see more, had to understand what I'd just witnessed. I'll never forget the decision I made next, probably the stupidest and bravest thing I've ever done. I started walking toward where it had left the trail, not running, not charging, but moving with determination. I had to know. As I approached the spot where it had veered off, I could clearly see where vegetation had been recently disturbed. The ferns and underbrush were pushed aside, creating a visible path down the ridge. I followed, my bow at the ready, though what good I thought that would do, I don't know. I'd gone maybe 30 yards down this makeshift path when I heard it, a sound that stopped me dead in my tracks. From somewhere ahead and below, maybe a couple 100 yards away, came a vocalization that I can only describe as a deep, guttural grunt, followed by something like a throat-clearing noise. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't an elk. It wasn't anything I'd heard in nearly 4 decades of hunting. That sound conveyed a message as clear as if it had been spoken in English. That's far enough. I listened for several minutes, straining to hear any movement, any indication of where the creature had gone. Nothing but that oppressive silence. The hair on my neck was still standing on end. Finally, common sense prevailed. I carefully backed up the way I'd come, returned to the main trail, and headed back to my truck. I told my hunting partners nothing when we regrouped that evening. What could I say? That I'd seen something impossible, that I'd encountered a creature straight out of campfire stories? They would have laughed it off, assumed I was pulling their leg. So I kept quiet, claiming I'd seen nothing all day. But inside, my mind was racing. For the next 6 weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. I pored over books about local wildlife, researched unusual bear behaviors, even reluctantly looked into stories about Sasquatch encounters, though I'd always dismissed such things as nonsense before. Nothing quite matched what I'd experienced. In late October, I made a decision. I needed to go back, alone, not to hunt, but to investigate. The weather had turned colder when I returned to the same trail. This time I brought a camera and a small notebook. I felt foolish, like some kind of amateur cryptozoologist, but I needed answers. I spent the entire day scouring the area. I found the exact spot where the creature had left the trail, followed the same path down the ridge that I'd started to take before. This time, with no sound to stop me, I continued all the way down to a small, relatively flat area nestled between 2 steep slopes. What I found there has haunted me ever since. In a clearing not visible from above was a large oval depression in the forest floor, maybe 7 feet long and 4 feet wide. The ground was packed down, the leaves and debris pushed aside, creating what looked unmistakably like a resting place. A bed, but not one made by any animal I recognized. No bear scrape, no deer bed. This was deliberate, constructed. I examined the area carefully. No trash, no signs of human camping, no tool marks on nearby branches. Nothing that would suggest people had created this spot. The surrounding area showed other subtle signs of habitation. Certain berry bushes had been stripped in a systematic way, not the random browsing of deer or elk. Several trees had broken branches at a height of at least 8 feet. Breaks that angled downward as if something had pushed them aside while walking. I took pictures, made notes, collected my evidence. As the day waned, that feeling of being watched returned. I didn't wait for darkness. Some instinct told me I shouldn't be there after sunset. The following year, in the summer of 1994, curiosity drove me back again. This time I explored a wider area, venturing further from the original encounter site. About half a mile away, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. Nestled against a rocky outcropping was a crude shelter. Not a random pile of branches, but a deliberately constructed lean-to. Large branches had been propped against the rock face, smaller ones interwoven to create a surprisingly effective windbreak. The ground inside was clear of rocks and debris. Outside were the remains of what appeared to be several partially eaten salmon, likely carried up from the creek about a quarter-mile below. What struck me most was the complete absence of human indicators. No cut marks from tools, no rope or twine, no nails or modern fasteners. Just raw materials gathered and assembled with what I can only describe as primitive intelligence. I've spent countless hours since then trying to rationalize what I saw that September morning and what I found in the months that followed. Every explanation I come up with falls short. It wasn't a bear. The movement, posture, and behavior were all wrong. It wasn't another hunter. No human moves with that fluid power or possesses that build. The shelter wasn't made by campers or hikers. There was no trail access, no fire ring, no trash, not a single sign of human tools. What I saw that day was something that shouldn't exist according to science, yet something I know with absolute certainty was real. It moved with purpose and awareness. It warned me away when I followed. It created structures that showed planning and intelligence. In the years since, I've returned to that area several times. I've never again seen the creature directly, but I've found more evidence, hair caught on tree bark that doesn't match any known wildlife, unusual tracks after rainfall, more of those distinctive shelters. I've told only a handful of people about this experience. Most react with polite skepticism or outright disbelief. I understand their reaction. Before that day, I would have been equally dismissive. What stays with me most isn't just the sighting itself. It's the intelligence I sensed behind the encounter, the deliberate way it moved off the trail when spotted, the warning vocalization instead of an aggressive charge, the constructed shelters that served clear purposes. These weren't the random behaviors of an animal, but suggested awareness and purpose beyond what we acknowledge exists in those forests. I don't know what to call what I saw that day. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, an unknown primate. The label doesn't really matter. What matters is that something shared that forest with me, something that watched me, evaluated me, and chose to reveal itself briefly before disappearing back into the wilderness that was clearly its home, not mine. I still hunt those woods, though never again in that specific area. It doesn't feel right, like I'd be trespassing. Sometimes when I'm sitting quietly in my stand at dawn, I feel that same sensation of being observed. The forest goes quiet, the hair on my neck rises, and I wonder if it's watching me again, just beyond the range of my vision, making assessments and decisions I can't begin to understand. I'm sharing this now because I'm getting older. The clarity of that experience hasn't faded with time. If anything, it's grown sharper as I've had years to analyze every detail. Whatever it was I encountered that morning, I believe it deserves to be acknowledged, even if never fully understood. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, just respected. Story 7. I still can't sleep with the tent flaps open. It's been 10 years now. 10 years since that Memorial Day weekend at Cunningham Campground on Mount Graham, and I still wake up sometimes thinking I can hear those sounds again. I never believed in any of that Bigfoot stuff. Still don't know what to call what happened to us that weekend. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and most of all, what I smelled. And nobody can tell me it was just a bear or my imagination running wild. My husband Carlos had been wanting to take the kids camping at Mount Graham for ages. He went there a lot when he was younger and kept telling our kids, Sophia and Miguel, about this perfect spot with wild raspberries. Sophia was turning 12 that weekend, and we thought it would be nice to celebrate her birthday outdoors. Miguel was 11 then, always following his big sister around. Carlos's brother Rafael and his wife Elena agreed to meet us there, and they arrived a day early to set up camp. We pulled into Cunningham Campground on Saturday, May 25th, around noon. It was a beautiful day, not too hot like down in the valley. The pine trees gave that perfect amount of shade, and the kids were beyond excited to sleep in the big 5-person tent Carlos had bought specially for this trip. When we arrived, Rafael and Elena had already claimed a nice spot near the corner of the campground, close to the restrooms, but not too close to other campers. They helped us set up our tent, and by 2 o'clock, we were all settled in. The campground wasn't full, but there were maybe 8 or 9 other groups scattered around. Normal weekend crowd, I guess. That first day went by so fast. We walked the dogs around the campground, let the kids explore a bit, and that evening we had a small birthday celebration for Sophia with a cake I'd carefully transported. Carlos built a fire, and we just sat around talking and watching the flames. The kids were exhausted and fell asleep by 9:30, and the rest of us followed soon after. Sunday morning is when things started to get weird. After breakfast, around 10:30, Carlos got all excited about showing everyone the raspberry bushes. "They're just up the trail behind the restrooms," he kept saying. "The best wild raspberries you've ever tasted." So we all went. Carlos, me, the kids, Rafael, Elena, and our 2 dogs on leashes. We found the trail easily enough. It started just behind the restrooms, a narrow dirt path winding up into the trees. After about 15 minutes of walking, we came across the raspberry bushes Carlos had talked about. There weren't many berries yet, probably too early in the season, but the kids were still excited to find a few ripe ones. Sophia had a walking stick she'd found near our campsite. Just a branch, really, but she was proud of it, using it to point out things along the trail. We kept going a bit past the raspberry bushes, the path getting steeper. Sophia was tapping her stick against trees as we walked, like kids do, and that's when we heard it. The sound was sudden and loud, like a massive tree crashing down somewhere above us on the hillside. All of us jumped. There was no wind that day, not even a breeze. The air was completely still. "What was that?" Elena asked, grabbing Raphael's arm. Carlos shrugged it off. "Probably a dead tree finally giving way. Happens all the time in forests." But something felt off about it. Trees don't just fall on perfectly calm days for no reason. "Let's head back," I suggested. "The trail's getting pretty steep anyway, and I don't want the kids slipping." On the way down, I kept feeling like something was watching us. Twice I heard twigs snapping behind me, and both times when I turned around there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows. I didn't mention it to the others, didn't want to scare the kids, but I noticed Raphael glancing over his shoulder too. We took some pictures near the raspberry bushes before heading back to camp. I remember checking my phone afterward and thinking how normal we all looked in those photos. No sign of what was about to happen. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. We grilled hot dogs for lunch. The kids played cards with their uncle, and Carlos and Rafael went for a short hike on another trail. That evening, we had a simple dinner and sat around the campfire again. but I noticed everyone seemed more quiet than the night before. When we finally decided to turn in around 9, Carlos set up our tent the way he always did, with the side panels open for ventilation, but covered by a rain tarp for privacy. Our tent was positioned at the edge of our site, facing toward the road that ran through the campground, with the back of the tent against a line of trees. Miguel fell asleep almost immediately. Sophia was next, then Carlos. I stayed awake a bit longer, reading with my little booklight until my eyes got heavy. I must have drifted off around midnight. I woke up when Carlos got out of his sleeping bag. "Just need to use the bathroom," he whispered, grabbing the flashlight. I checked my phone. It was a little after 1 in the morning. I heard the tent zipper, then Carlos's footsteps heading toward the restrooms. He couldn't have been gone more than 5 minutes. When he came back, he zipped up the tent and climbed back into his sleeping bag. "All good," he whispered. "Go back to sleep." But I couldn't fall asleep right away. Something felt different about the night. The usual forest sounds, the crickets, the occasional owl, they seemed muted somehow. That's when I saw it. From where I was lying, I could see the front opening of the tent through the mesh, and something moved past it, something big. It moved so quickly, just a dark silhouette against the slightly lighter background of the night sky. For a split second, I thought it might be another camper walking past with a flashlight turned off. But it was too big, too broad, and it moved in a strange way, fluid but powerful. I was about to wake Carlos when Sophia sat up suddenly. "Mom," she whispered urgently, "someone's outside." My heart started racing. "Did you see something?" I asked, keeping my voice down. She nodded, her eyes wide. "It was big, really big, and I heard footsteps on the road." "What kind of footsteps?" "Flat," she said, "like someone walking with bare feet, but quiet." Carlos stirred. "What's going on?" he mumbled. I shushed him. "Sophia and I both saw something outside the tent." He sighed and reached for the flashlight. "Probably just someone from another campsite walking to the bathroom," he said, but I could tell he was trying to convince himself as much as us. He unzipped the tent just enough to peek out and swept the flashlight beam across the area. "Nothing there," he said, zipping it back up. "Try to get some sleep." Eventually, Sophia drifted off again, and Carlos's breathing deepened as he fell back asleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever we'd seen was still out there. I lay awake, straining to hear any unusual sounds over the soft breathing of my family. I must have finally fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, I was jolting awake to a sound right outside our tent. Chewing. Loud, wet, chewing sounds, and smacking lips. It was coming from directly behind where my cot was positioned, on the side of the tent that faced the trees. The sounds were unmistakable. Something was eating. But what terrified me most was the height of the sounds. I was on a cot that sat about 2 feet off the ground, and the chewing sounds were coming from well above my head level. Whatever was making those sounds had to be tall. Really tall. And then I smelled it. I've tried for years to describe that smell to people, but words fail me. It wasn't just bad body odor or a wet animal smell. It was primal, like damp fur mixed with something rotten, but also musky and almost human in some indefinable way. It made my nose burn and my eyes water. The chewing and smacking continued for what felt like forever, but was probably about 15 minutes by my phone's clock. I was frozen in place, afraid that any movement would draw attention. Suddenly there was another sound from down the road. I think it was someone in another campsite opening their car door. The chewing stopped abruptly. I heard what sounded like heavy breathing, just once, and then nothing. The presence moved away so silently I couldn't tell it had gone, except that the smell gradually faded. I didn't sleep another minute that night. I lay there clutching my phone, ready to call for help, until the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. When everyone finally woke up, I told Carlos everything. He looked concerned but skeptical. When I mentioned the smell, though, something changed in his expression. "I smelled something weird when I went to the bathroom," he admitted. "I thought maybe it was a skunk or something, but it didn't smell quite like that either." Rafael and Elena came over while we were making breakfast, and Elena immediately asked if we'd heard anything strange during the night. "Like what?" Carlos asked. "I don't know," she said, wrapping her sweater tighter around herself despite the morning warmth. "Rafael thinks I dreamed it, but I swear I heard something moving around our campsite around 1:30, too big to be a raccoon. And there was this smell." Sophia, who'd been quiet all morning, suddenly spoke up. "I saw something. It walked past our tent after Dad came back from the bathroom." Rafael looked uncomfortable. "Probably just another camper." "No," Sophia insisted. "It was too big, and it didn't walk like a person." Miguel, who hadn't said he'd seen or heard anything, now looked scared. "Can we go home?" he asked in a small voice. Carlos, always the practical one, suggested we finish our planned activities and head home in the afternoon as scheduled. No one argued. We half-heartedly went through the motions of enjoying our last day, hiking a short trail near the campground, cooking lunch. But the easy camaraderie of the first day was gone. Everyone seemed on edge, watching the tree line, startling at small noises. As we packed up to leave, I noticed something strange near where the back of our tent had been. The pine needles and dirt were disturbed in an unusual pattern, almost like something heavy had stood in one spot for a while. And there, partially hidden under fallen leaves, was a half-eaten apple. The thing is, we hadn't brought any apples. When we got home that evening, we unpacked and tried to put the strange events behind us. It wasn't until about a week later, when I was having coffee with my friend Diane and telling her about our trip, that she jokingly said, "Sounds like you had a run-in with Bigfoot." I laughed it off, but something clicked in my mind. That night, after the kids were in bed, I started researching. What I found sent chills down my spine. Mount Graham has a history of Bigfoot sightings going back decades. The Western Apache people who originally inhabited the area have stories about a tall, hairy being they call the mountain spirit, or Dilna Odili, that's associated with the mountain. And the behavior I read about matched our experience. Tree knocks, like the tree falling we heard, following hikers, investigating camps at night, food being taken. I've never been able to explain what happened that night. Carlos still thinks it was probably a bear, though he admits the footsteps Sophia heard and the figure we both saw doesn't fit. Rafael and Elena never camped again after that weekend. As for me, I've only been camping once since then, at a busy campground in a state park with cabins and rangers patrolling regularly. I kept all the windows and doors closed tight that time. When people ask me if I believe in Bigfoot now, I don't have a simple answer. I believe in what I experienced, the massive silhouette moving past our tent, those distinctive chewing sounds coming from above head height, and that smell I'll never forget. Something was watching us at Cunningham Campground that night, something that followed us from the Raspberry Trail, waited for darkness, and came to investigate our tent. Whether it has a name or not doesn't really matter to me anymore. All I know is that whenever Sophia taps a stick against a tree, I find myself listening for something crashing in the distance, and I never, ever leave the tent flaps open at night. Anahasa. Story 8. I still can't believe what I saw that day. It's been over 2 years now, and I've gone back and forth about whether to share this. I've always been rational, methodical. It's why I became a biologist in the first place. But what happened in Coconino that weekend has haunted me in ways I never expected. I'd been looking forward to that camping trip for weeks. Working at Arizona State University keeps me busy, and my research on forest ecosystems rarely gives me time to actually enjoy the wilderness I study. The irony isn't lost on me. So when I finally cleared a weekend in June of 2021, I packed up my Subaru and headed to the Mogollon Rim area of Coconino National Forest. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon, maybe around 3 p.m. Temperature was perfect, high 70s with a light breeze. I'd set up at Pine Flat Campground, nothing fancy, just my two-person tent, a folding chair, and my small camp stove. The campground was about half full, weekend warriors escaping Phoenix's heat, a few RVs, some families. Normal summer crowd. I'd spent the morning hiking and collecting some soil samples, old habits, but by afternoon I was actually relaxing, sitting in my camping chair with a cup of tea and reading the latest issue of the Journal of Forest Ecology. There was an interesting article on mycorrhizal networks in old-growth forests that had captured my attention. I remember looking up occasionally, giving my eyes a break from the small print. That's when I started noticing the ecological diversity around me. One of those professional observations you can't really turn off. The ponderosas dominated, of course, but the mix of aspens, firs, and oak created this perfect transitional zone ecosystem. I was mentally cataloging tree species when something caught my eye. It was movement, about 125 yards away, maybe more, in the western portion of the campground where the trees grew thicker. Something large and dark was moving rapidly from north to south through a shaded section. My first thought, oddly enough, was that it was a kid on a bike, though there wasn't any trail over there that I knew of. It was just an impression of size and speed. But as I focused, I realized something was very wrong with that initial assessment. Whatever was moving wasn't on a bike. It was bipedal, moving upright, but with a strange fluidity I've never seen in a human runner. The creature, and I don't use that term lightly, maintained this slight forward lean while running, but its head stayed remarkably steady. If you've ever watched distance runners, you know how much their heads bob up and down with each stride. This thing's head barely moved at all, like it was gliding despite clearly running at high speed. From my angle, I could only see it from about the waist up because there was a slight depression in the ground and some fallen logs obscuring the lower half. But what I could see was massive. The torso was at least twice as wide as an average man's. And I'm not a small guy at 6 feet tall. The proportions were just wrong, and there wasn't a distinct neck that I could make out. The head seemed to sit directly on the shoulders. The coloration is hard to describe precisely. It appeared almost black, but where the sunlight hit it along the profile, there was this reddish-brown tint. Not clothing, fur or hair. I'm certain of that now. I couldn't make out facial features from that distance, but the silhouette was unmistakably not human. The entire sighting lasted maybe 3 seconds before it disappeared behind a stand of trees. 3 seconds that have made me question everything I thought I knew about North American wildlife. I sat there for a moment, mouth probably hanging open, trying to process what I'd just seen. My heart was racing. The rational part of my brain immediately started trying to explain it away. A bear standing on hind legs? No, the movement was all wrong. A person in dark clothing, not with that build and that movement pattern. Without really thinking it through, I stood up, set my journal on the chair, and started walking toward the area where I'd seen it. In retrospect, probably not the smartest move, but scientific curiosity is a powerful thing. I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting to see it again, but there was nothing. It took me a couple of minutes to reach the spot. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it had become. The birds that had been singing all afternoon had gone silent. Even the distant sounds of other campers seemed muted somehow. There was this heavy feeling in the air, like the atmosphere itself had thickened. I started examining the ground where I thought the figure had passed. The area was a mix of pine needles, fallen leaves, and patches of grass and ferns. At the north edge of a small drainage ditch, I found the first sign, a clear path of crushed grass, about 2 feet wide. Following this, I could see where plants had been flattened in a straight line heading south, exactly along the path I'd seen it take. What really sent a chill down my spine was when I found a damaged fern near the wooden fence bordering the campground. The plant wasn't just bent, it was partially uprooted like something heavy had clipped it while passing. Next to it, the wooden fence, about 3 feet high, showed no signs of damage. Whatever it was had simply stepped over it without breaking stride. On the other side of the fence, the forest became thicker with more undergrowth. I could see where branches had been pushed aside and vegetation disturbed, continuing in that same southbound direction. I stood there for several minutes, debating whether to follow further into the woods. Common sense finally prevailed. I was alone, unarmed, with no way to communicate if I got into trouble. The sun was starting to lower, and I knew how quickly darkness falls in the forest, so I reluctantly turned back toward my campsite, taking a few photos of the disturbed vegetation with my phone, though they hardly captured what I was seeing. Walking back, I kept looking over my shoulder. The forest that had seemed so peaceful just an hour before now felt watchful, tense. I became hyper-aware of every sound. The crack of twigs, rustling leaves, the low moan of wind through the pines. Normal forest sounds that suddenly seemed significant, coded messages I couldn't decipher. When I got back to my campsite, I immediately checked the surrounding area, half expecting to find my things disturbed. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, but I couldn't shake this feeling of being observed. I sat down and tried to record everything I'd seen while it was still fresh, making detailed notes in my field journal, size estimates, movement patterns, coloration. The scientist in me was trying to regain control through data and observation. As evening approached, more campers returned from their daytime activities. I wanted to ask if anyone else had seen anything unusual, but what would I say? "Excuse me, did you happen to see a 7-foot hairy humanoid running through the campground today?" I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not only would I sound crazy, but as a biologist, my professional reputation would be at risk. I made myself a simple dinner on my camp stove, but I wasn't hungry. I kept scanning the tree line, feeling exposed. As darkness fell, I seriously considered packing up and driving back to Phoenix, but that would mean traversing forest roads in the dark. Not exactly safer than staying put. Around 8:30, I heard something large moving through the underbrush about 50 yards from my campsite. I froze, my flashlight beam fixed on my half-eaten meal. The sounds continued for maybe 10 seconds, branches snapping, leaves rustling, then silence. Could have been a deer or elk, probably was. But the timing felt deliberate somehow, like I was being reminded that I wasn't alone. I retreated to my tent earlier than planned, zipping myself in as if thin nylon could provide any real protection. I positioned my flashlight, knife, and car keys within easy reach. Sleep seemed impossible, but exhaustion eventually won out, though I woke at every sound, real or imagined. At approximately 3 a.m., something woke me. Not a sound exactly, but a change in pressure, like when someone enters a room and the air shifts. I lay perfectly still, listening. That's when I heard it. Heavy, deliberate footsteps circling my campsite. Not an animal on 4 legs, but the distinct cadence of a biped. 2 steps, pause, 3 steps, pause. Getting closer to my tent with each circuit. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to reach for my flashlight, but couldn't move. The footsteps stopped directly outside my tent, no more than 10 feet away. There was a deep, rumbling sound, not quite a growl, lower and more resonant, almost subsonic. I could feel it more than hear it, vibrating in my chest. Then came the smell, musky and wild, like wet fur and something else I can't describe. Primal, ancient. It seeped through the tent fabric, overwhelming in its intensity. I don't know how long I lay there, barely breathing. It felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Eventually, the footsteps retreated, slow and unhurried, fading into the forest sounds. I didn't move until first light, when exhaustion finally pulled me under again. When I woke around 7, the campground was already stirring with morning activities. Everything looked so normal. Families making breakfast, hikers preparing for day trips. I felt disconnected from it all, like I'd spent the night in a different reality. I packed up quickly, but before leaving, I walked to where I thought the footsteps had been. The ground was too hard-packed to show prints, but near the edge of my sight, where the soil was softer, I found it. A single partial footprint, at least 15 inches long and incredibly wide, with what looked like 5 toes. Too big for any human, too structured for a bear. I took photos, used my water bottle for scale. Then I placed my own boot next to it, size 12, and it was dwarfed by comparison. As a field researcher, I've made plaster casts of animal tracks hundreds of times. I had the materials in my car, but couldn't bring myself to make a permanent record. Part of me didn't want proof of what I'd experienced. Making a cast would make it real in a way I wasn't prepared to accept. I left the campground by 8 a.m., driving back to Phoenix in a daze. For weeks afterward, I pored over field guides, research papers, and yes, even Bigfoot encounter reports. The more I researched, the more I found accounts with disturbing similarities to what I'd experienced. The steady head position while running, the proportions, the behavior of circling a campsite at night. As a biologist, I've been trained to trust evidence, to follow data wherever it leads. But academia has no place for the creature I saw. Mentioning it to colleagues would be professional suicide. So I've kept quiet, cataloging my experience alongside my legitimate research, building a personal database of similar encounters in the region. I've returned to Coconino 3 times since then, with motion-activated cameras and audio recorders. Nothing conclusive yet, but twice I've found similar footprints, and once my recorder captured that same subsonic rumble at 2 a.m. that I felt that night. Too brief to be definitive, not quite enough to share with the scientific community, but enough to keep me searching. I don't know what I saw running through that forest. I don't know what circled my tent in the darkness, but I know it exists. And I know it knew I was watching it. Sometimes, especially on quiet nights when the wind moves through the trees outside my window, I can't shake the feeling that it's still watching me too.
Story 9. I've never told this story to anyone outside my family and a couple of close friends.
Even now, typing this out, my hands are getting shaky and I keep looking over my shoulder. It's been 27 years, but what happened that day in June of '96 still haunts me. I was 15 then, living on our family ranch north of Gila Bend, Arizona. That summer was hot as hell, even by Arizona standards. We'd been dealing with a dry spell that had the Gila River running lower than usual. I spent most days riding Thunderbolt, this beautiful palomino we had. That horse was my best friend, steady, smart, and so well trained you barely needed to use the reins. On this particular day, June 18th, I decided to ride out to meet my sister Ashley and her friend Rebecca, who was supposed to be hanging out down by the river. It was around 2 in the afternoon. I remember because I'd just finished lunch, and Mom was giving me grief about doing the dishes before heading out. I promised I'd do them when I got back. I didn't even bother with a saddle that day, just threw a bridle on Thunderbolt and hopped on bareback. Our 2 Rottweilers, Brutus and Della, came bounding after me as I rode out. Those dogs followed me everywhere. Brutus was this massive tank of a dog, all muscle, while Della was smaller but way more alert. They were my shadows, always protecting me. The ride to the northern boundary of our property was routine. I'd done it 1,000 times. The landscape was all desert scrub and rocky outcroppings, with the occasional mesquite tree providing tiny patches of shade. Once I hit the boundary, I turned west toward the river, where I was supposed to meet Ashley and Rebecca. There was this dirt road that ran parallel to the river, separated from the water by a barbed wire fence and a thick growth of salt cedar trees. These weren't your typical cedars. They're more like dense, tangled bushes that grow tall along the water. Perfect hiding spots for all kinds of wildlife. Everything was normal for the first 20 minutes of the ride. The dogs were running ahead, occasionally darting off to investigate some smell, then racing back to me. Thunderbolt was in a good mood, his ears perked forward, moving at an easy trot. Then we came to this gap in the fence, a spot where someone had cut through the barbed wire to get access to the river. It wasn't unusual. Local fishermen did that all the time. But as we approached this opening, both dogs suddenly stopped. Like dead in their tracks stopped. At first I didn't think much of it. Dogs stop to sniff things all the time, right? But then I noticed how they were acting. Brutus's hackles went up and Della's ears flattened against her head. They were both facing the thick salt cedar growth beyond the fence, completely rigid. Thunderbolt sensed it too. He started shifting beneath me, sidestepping nervously. His ears were flicking back and forth and I could feel his muscles tensing. For a horse that rarely spooked at anything, this was weird behavior. "What's up, guys?" I said, patting Thunderbolt's neck to calm him. My voice sounded strange in the sudden quiet. Even the cicadas seemed to have stopped buzzing. That's when Brutus and Della did something I'd never seen before. Without any warning, both dogs turned and bolted back the way we'd come. Not just running, I mean full-on sprinting like their lives depended on it. These were dogs that had faced down coyotes without flinching. And now they were running away from... what? Thunderbolt was getting harder to control. He started snorting and backing up, eyes wide. I was struggling to keep him from rearing when I heard it. A sound from the salt cedars. Not a twig snapping, not an animal call. It was heavier, like something large moving through the undergrowth. I still remember the chill that ran down my spine when I looked toward the source of the noise. At first, all I saw was movement behind the dense foliage. Then, partially hidden behind a salt cedar trunk, I saw... it. Eyes. That's what I registered first. Dark, intelligent eyes, set deep in a face that was both human-like and completely alien at the same time. The creature was watching me with an intensity that felt like it was looking straight into my soul. When it stepped fully into view, I couldn't breathe. I'm not talking figuratively. I physically couldn't draw air into my lungs. What I was seeing didn't make sense. The thing was standing upright on two legs, covered in long, matted brown hair. I'm not talking about fur like a bear. This was more like human hair, but longer, thicker, with what looked like twigs and plant matter tangled throughout. But it was the size that froze me in place. The barbed wire fence, which had to be at least 4 feet high, didn't even reach the top of its thigh. Its arms hung long at its sides, nearly to its knees, and its shoulders were impossibly broad. The build wasn't just big, it was massive, powerful. Like something designed by nature to survive in the harshest conditions imaginable. We just stared at each other. I don't know how long the moment lasted, probably just seconds, but it felt like time had stopped. There was intelligence in those eyes, curiosity even, not the mindless stare of an animal, but something calculating and aware. Thunderbolt was basically losing it underneath me at this point, dancing in place, ready to bolt. I knew I wouldn't be able to hold him much longer, and honestly, I didn't want to. I loosened my grip on the reins and gave him his head, letting him know it was okay to run. He didn't need convincing. The instant I eased up, he was gone, sprinting down the dirt road alongside the river. I just held on, gripping his mane, my legs clamped around his sides. That's when something happened that I still can't explain. As we galloped along the road, I heard movement in the trees to our right. I looked over, and the thing was keeping pace with us. A horse at full gallop can hit 30 miles per hour, and this creature was matching that speed on 2 legs, running through dense undergrowth. It wasn't crashing through the brush either. It moved with this bizarre grace, its long legs eating up the distance in powerful strides. The way it navigated the obstacles, ducking under branches, weaving between trees, showed an intimate knowledge of the terrain. We ran like that for what must have been a quarter mile. When the road curved away from the river and headed toward our ranch, I risked one more glance back. The creature had stopped at the edge of the tree line. It was just standing there, watching me leave. Something about that final look, the stillness of it, was almost more terrifying than the chase. I didn't slow Thunderbolt until we were well within sight of our ranch house. By the time we clattered into the yard, I was sobbing, barely able to stay on. My mom, Lucia, ran out onto the porch, followed by my brother Carlos. "¿Qué pasó? What happened?" My mum's face was white with fear as I slid off Thunderbolt, my legs buckling beneath me. I tried to tell them between gasps what I'd seen. The words tumbled out in a jumble. Huge, walking like a person, hair all over it. Fast as Thunderbolt. Carlos laughed. He was 17 and thought he knew everything. "You saw a bear, dummy, or a really big javelina." "It wasn't a bear," I screamed at him. "It was standing on two legs. It was taller than Dad." Mom put her arm around me, shooting Carlos a warning look. "Jamie Meja, you're exhausted and scared. It was probably just a large animal that your imagination turned into something else." But I could see the worry in her eyes. Our dogs weren't back yet, which was totally out of character for them. And Thunderbolt was still trembling, streaked with sweat, his eyes rolling. Dad and Uncle Raphael weren't home. They were in town buying supplies. When Mom called them on the radio, they said they'd head straight to the river to find Ashley and Rebecca. I was terrified for my sister. What if that thing found them? About an hour later, they all returned. Ashley and Rebecca seemed fine, if confused by all the fuss. When Dad asked them if they'd seen anything unusual, they shook their heads. "The horses were acting kind of weird when we left the river, though," Rebecca said. "Like super jumpy. We figured there might have been a snake or something." That night, Dad and Uncle Raphael took rifles and went back to where I'd seen the creature. They came back empty-handed, saying they hadn't found anything except some broken branches and what looked like large impressions in the soft earth near the river. But the ground was too dry and hard to hold clear tracks. Dad never outright said I was lying, but I could tell he didn't fully believe me either. "Maybe it was a very large man," he suggested, "a drifter or something. No human could move that fast through that terrain. No human had proportions like that." But I stopped trying to convince them. A few years later, after a rare heavy rain, Dad and Uncle Raphael found something along that same stretch of riverbank, enormous footprints in the mud. Dad took photos of them next to his own boot for scale. The prints were at least 17 inches long and incredibly wide, with what looked like 5 toes. Nothing that lives in Arizona should leave tracks like that. I later found out we weren't the only ones who'd had weird experiences in that area. About a year after my encounter, 2 kids from a farm about 5 miles downriver told people they'd been chased by what they described as a giant gorilla while they were fishing. Most people laughed it off as childhood imagination, but their story was eerily similar to mine. I'm 32 now, living in Phoenix with a family of my own. I've never gone back to that spot on the river, even when visiting my parents. Some memories you just don't want to revisit. What bothers me most isn't just what I saw, it's the questions that remain. The intelligence in those eyes. The way it watched me, kept pace with me, then simply stopped and observed my retreat. It wasn't trying to catch me. It seemed more like it was evaluating me. I've read accounts online from others who've had similar encounters. Some call it Sasquatch or Bigfoot. The Native Americans in our area have legends about tall, hairy beings that live in remote places. Growing up, I always thought those were just stories to keep kids from wandering too far. For years, I tried to convince myself it was just a bear, that I'd panicked and my teenage mind had turned it into something more fantastic. But then I remember those eyes, the deliberate way it moved, the impossible speed. Bears don't run like that. Nothing does. I've told my husband about it, but I can see the doubt in his eyes when the subject comes up. He humors me, but doesn't believe. I get it. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, watching from the thick growth along the Gila River. If other people have seen it, but stayed quiet, afraid of the ridicule. If I'd had a camera back then, would I be brave enough to share the photos? Or would I hide them away, scared of what they might prove? All I know for sure is that on that hot June afternoon in '96, the world as I understood it changed forever. There are things in the wild places of this earth that defy explanation, that exist in the shadows of our awareness. Things that watch us far more often than we see them. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night and the wind rustles the trees outside our house, I swear I can feel those eyes again, watching, calculating, assessing. It's on those nights that I double-check the locks and pull the curtains tight. Because once you've been seen by something that shouldn't exist, you never quite shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching, waiting, remembering you just as vividly as you remember it. Story 10. I've been debating whether to share this for the past year, but I need to get it off my chest. What happened that night near the Yakima River Delta still haunts me, and I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder whenever I'm outdoors, after dark. This happened in July of 2021. I was in my third year at Washington State University Tri-Cities, majoring in environmental science. Finals had just wrapped up, and I needed to decompress before starting my summer research project. Living in Richland, I'd often drive out to quieter spots around the Yakima River Delta to escape the lights and noise of town. It's not exactly remote wilderness, but there are plenty of secluded areas where you can disappear for a few hours. That night, I packed some snacks, a blanket, and my star chart app. I'd been into amateur astronomy since high school, and the summer sky in Washington can be incredible on clear nights. I drove my Honda CR-V down the main roads until I reached one of the dirt access roads that wind toward the river. It was around 10 p.m. when I parked in a small clearing about a quarter-mile from the main road. The spot was elevated enough that I could see across the delta and had a perfect view of the night sky. I killed the engine, turned off my headlights, and just sat there for a few minutes, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The moon was just a sliver that night, which made for ideal stargazing. I grabbed my stuff from the back seat and spread my blanket on the hood of my car. I laid back against the windshield and just watched the sky for hours, occasionally checking constellations on my app. The temperature was perfect, warm enough that I didn't need a jacket, with this gentle breeze coming off the river. I remember feeling so peaceful. The only sounds were crickets, occasional rustling in the brush, and distant frogs near the water. Normal night sounds that I never paid much attention to. Around 1:30, I noticed something weird. The crickets suddenly went quiet. Not gradually, but like someone had flipped a switch. I sat up and looked around, thinking maybe a coyote or something was nearby. I didn't see anything, but that silence felt heavy, you know, like when you can feel a storm coming. I told myself I was being paranoid and laid back down, but I couldn't relax anymore. Something felt off. I tried focusing on the stars again, but I kept straining to hear anything beyond that unsettling silence. After another 20 minutes of this, I decided to call it a night. It was close to 2 a.m. anyway, and I had to be up relatively early the next day. I slid off the hood, folded my blanket, and tossed everything into the back seat. When I got in the driver's seat, I realized how vulnerable I'd been, just lying there in the dark. My car was the only one around for miles, probably. I locked the doors immediately, which seems silly in retrospect because they had been unlocked the entire time I was stargazing. I turned the key and the dashboard lit up, but I hadn't turned on the headlights yet. I was about to, when I heard something moving in the brush about 30 feet in front of my car. Not small movements like a rabbit or raccoon. These were heavy steps, breaking branches. My first thought was deer, but it didn't sound right for deer. The footfalls were too deliberate, too spaced out. My heart started racing. I sat there frozen, key in the ignition, engine humming, staring into darkness. Part of me didn't want to turn on the lights because I was afraid of what I might see. Another part needed desperately to know what was out there. I took a deep breath and hit the headlight switch. What I saw in those beams of light still doesn't make sense to me. About 20 feet ahead, right where the dirt road met the brushy edge, stood two figures. Not animals, not exactly human either. They were upright, covered in shaggy brown hair, standing completely still and staring directly at me. The larger one was huge, easily 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms. The smaller one stood maybe 6 feet, with similar proportions but less bulk. Both had hair covering their entire bodies, including their faces. The hair wasn't uniform, it was patchy in places, longer around the shoulders and shorter on the limbs. Their faces are what really got to me. I could make out dark eyes reflecting my headlights, set deep under heavy brow ridges. Their noses were wide and flat. I couldn't see mouths clearly through the facial hair, but their whole face structure was just wrong. Not animal, not human, something in between. For maybe 5 seconds, we just stared at each other. I was paralyzed. They seemed equally surprised by the sudden light. The smaller one moved first, turning slightly toward the larger one without taking its eyes off my car. The bigger one's posture changed, its shoulders hunched forward, and it took half a step back. That's when I snapped out of it. I slammed the car into reverse, hit the gas harder than I meant to, and nearly fishtailed turning around on that dirt road. I remember glancing in my mirrors as I straightened out, and they were still standing there, watching me leave. They didn't chase or move toward me at all. I hit the main road and drove well above the speed limit all the way back to town. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. I kept checking my mirrors, convinced they were somehow following me, though that was impossible given how fast I was driving. When I got back to my apartment, I double-locked everything and sat on my couch until dawn, unable to sleep or even close my eyes. Every time I did, I saw those figures illuminated in my headlights. The next morning, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe people in ghillie suits playing a prank, but who would be out there at 2 in the morning waiting for random stargazers? Maybe I'd fallen asleep on my car and dreamed the whole thing. But the fear I felt was too real, too visceral. After a few days of barely sleeping, I decided to tell someone. My ecology professor, Dr. Harrison, had always been approachable. During his office hours, I hesitantly described what I'd seen, expecting him to laugh or suggest I'd seen bears standing on their hind legs. Instead, he got really quiet and asked for the exact location. When I showed him on a map, he nodded and said, "You're not the first person to see something like this in that area." He told me about a park ranger named David Mitchell, who had been documenting strange sightings around the Yakima River for years. According to Dr. Harrison, similar reports had come from Chinook Pass and the Blue Mountains. I asked if he thought I'd seen Sasquatch, feeling ridiculous even saying the word out loud. He just shrugged and said, "Washington has more reported Sasquatch sightings than any other state. I'm not saying that's what you saw, but I'm not dismissing it either." That conversation gave me enough validation to start researching. I found online forums where people described encounters frighteningly similar to mine. The height, the hair patterns, the way they stood completely upright, the apparent family groups, it all matched. I learned that the Yakima River Delta is considered a corridor for these creatures, connecting the Cascade Range to the Blue Mountains. About 2 weeks after my encounter, I worked up the courage to go back to that spot during daylight. I brought my roommate with me, not telling her exactly why I wanted to check out this random dirt road. When we reached the clearing where I'd parked that night, I felt sick to my stomach. Everything looked so normal in the light. making me question my sanity all over again. We walked around a bit, and I casually led us toward the spot where I'd seen the figures. I was looking for any sign, broken branches, unusually large footprints, hair caught on brush, anything to validate what I'd seen. My roommate thought I was acting weird, especially when I kept examining the ground and vegetation. Then she called me over to look at something. About 50 yards from where I'd seen them, deeper into the brush, several small trees were broken, not cut but snapped about 5 feet up the trunk. They were 2-inch diameter trees, broken as easily as someone might snap a pencil. Further in, we found a clear area where the grass was flattened in a roughly circular pattern about 8 feet across, like something large had been lying there. My roommate thought it was probably where deer had bedded down, but the broken trees didn't fit that explanation. I didn't tell her what I'd seen, but those signs were enough to convince me I hadn't imagined the whole thing. Since that night, I've gone down a rabbit hole researching these creatures. I've learned they're most active at dawn and dusk, prefer riparian corridors for travel, and despite their size, are incredibly elusive. They apparently have acute senses, especially hearing and smell, which explains why the crickets went silent before I saw anything. They sensed them coming before I did. What confuses me most about my encounter is how close to town it happened. Richland isn't a huge city, but it's not the remote wilderness either. The Delta area is less than 10 minutes from residential neighborhoods. How could these creatures exist so close to human development without being definitively documented? Yet the more I researched, the more reports I found from areas just outside town limits. Last month, I finally worked up the courage to contact Ranger Mitchell. I found his email through a local Bigfoot research group and sent him my account. He responded within hours, asking detailed questions about the location, the creature's appearance, and their behavior. When I mentioned how they seemed startled by my headlights, he said that matched other reports. These beings apparently avoid direct confrontation whenever possible. Mitchell has been documenting sightings since 2002 and believes there's a small population that moves between 3 main areas: the Yakima River near Richland, Chinook Pass, and the Blue Mountains. He's recorded over 30 credible sightings in that time, plus countless track finds and strange audio recordings. The most disturbing thing he shared with me was about his brother's experience in the Blue Mountains last summer. His brother's family was sleeping in their 5th-wheel trailer when something began violently shaking it in the middle of the night. Whatever it was had enough strength to rock a 30-foot trailer, but disappeared without a trace when his brother went outside to investigate. I still go stargazing, but never alone and never in that spot. I carry bear spray now and don't stay out after midnight. Some friends think I'm overreacting to what was probably just a bear encounter, but I know what I saw. Those weren't bears. They moved wrong, stood wrong, watched me with too much intelligence. What haunts me most isn't the fear I felt in that moment, it's the realization that came later. Those creatures weren't aggressive. They seemed just as startled by me as I was by them. They were just there, existing in this shared space we know almost nothing about. If they wanted to hurt me, they easily could have. My car door wouldn't have stopped something strong enough to snap trees. I wonder how many times I've been watched while stargazing or hiking, completely unaware. How many times have they been there in the darkness just beyond my perception? The thought makes me shiver even now. Sometimes at night, I still hear that sudden silence when all the insects stop at once. When that happens, I go inside and lock my doors, because now I know what that silence means. Something is out there watching, something that doesn't want to be seen but is curious about us nonetheless. I don't know what to call them. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, unknown primates. The labels don't matter. What matters is they're real, they're intelligent, and they're closer than most people realize. The Yakima River Delta connects wilderness to civilization, and sometimes the boundaries between them blur in the darkness. I still have so many questions. Were they a parent and child? Do they have a language? How do they stay hidden so effectively? But one thing I don't question anymore is what I saw. Those 5 seconds of direct eye contact changed how I understand the world. There are things in the forests of Washington that science hasn't explained or even properly acknowledged. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm just sharing what happened because keeping it bottled up has been eating at me. Maybe someone reading this has had a similar experience and feels as isolated as I did. If nothing else, maybe my story will make you more aware of your surroundings next time you're out alone at night. The wildest part? Sometimes I find myself driving out toward the Delta at sunset, parking at a safe distance and just watching. Part of me hopes to see them again, to confirm I'm not crazy. Another part hopes I never do, but I can't shake the feeling that they're out there, watching back, just beyond where my eyes can see. Story 11. I've never told this story outside of a handful of people because I know exactly how it sounds. But what happened that day on Interstate 10 has bothered me for 33 years now, and I need to get it out there. Maybe someone else has seen the same thing. Back in July of 1990, I was a 21-year-old Army specialist stationed at Fort Huachuca in Arizona. I'd been in the service about 3 years by then. That summer was brutally hot, even by Arizona standards. We're talking triple digits before noon most days. On July 19th, I was assigned to a military funeral detail. For those who don't know, that's when active duty personnel provide military honors at a veteran's funeral. Folding the flag, playing taps, that kind of thing. Our detail was heading to a small town north of the base, where a Vietnam vet had passed away. There were 7 of us total, along with our equipment. We left the base around 6:30 that morning in one of those standard white military passenger vans. I remember being tired as hell because I'd pulled guard duty the night before, so I claimed a window seat on the left side, planning to catch some sleep once we hit the highway. The heat was already building even that early. I could feel it radiating through the window glass. After about 45 minutes, we merged onto Interstate 10 heading west. Everything was normal, just another hot day, another detail. We'd done dozens of these, and while the ceremony itself always demanded respect and focus, the trips there and back were usually just downtime. Around 7:30, the van started making this weird knocking sound from somewhere in the engine. Sergeant Miller, who was driving, pulled over onto the shoulder. The highway was pretty empty at that point, just occasional traffic passing in both directions. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by that classic Arizona desert landscape, all sand, scrub, and small rocky hills stretching out forever. Everyone started groaning and complaining, knowing we might be late now. Most of the guys got out to stretch their legs while Miller popped the hood to see what was wrong. I stayed in my seat, though. I was too damn tired to move, and stepping out into that heat seemed worse than just sitting there, so I just leaned against the window, staring across the highway at nothing but desert. An 18-wheeler passed us going eastbound, kicking up dust. As it cleared my line of sight, that's when I noticed something moving on the other side of the highway. At first I thought it was a deer, or maybe a really big coyote, but something about the movement seemed off. Then it emerged fully from a small gully about 50 yards across the road, and I felt my whole body go cold despite the heat. It was walking upright, on 2 legs, like a person, but it wasn't a person, not even close. This thing was tall, easily over 6 feet, and covered in this tan, sandy-colored hair or fur that matched the desert almost perfectly. If it had been standing still, I might have missed it completely. The hair looked coarse and shaggy, especially around its shoulders. And Jesus, those shoulders, they were massive, connected to arms that looked powerful enough to rip a car door off its hinges. Its proportions were all wrong for a human. The chest was barrel-shaped, the arms longer than they should be, and the legs were thick and powerful, like a sprinter's times 2. It moved with this fluid, athletic stride that covered ground faster than a person jogging, but it wasn't actually running, just walking with purpose. I remember gripping the armrest so hard my fingers hurt, trying to process what I was seeing. I wanted to call out to the others, but my voice just wouldn't work. I was literally frozen, watching this thing that shouldn't exist walking across the desert like it owned it. Then it reached the top of this small embankment about 100 yards from the highway, and it turned its head back toward the road, toward our van. That's when I saw its face. God, that face. It wasn't an animal face, not like a bear or an ape exactly. There was something disturbingly aware in its features. The eyes were deep set but clearly visible even at that distance, dark and intelligent. The face had this pronounced brow ridge and a somewhat flattened nose. Its mouth was set in this grim line. The whole face looked weathered, almost leathery. For a split second, I swear those eyes locked with mine, and I felt this jolt of recognition pass between us, like it knew I was watching it, like it was assessing me right back. Then it turned away and continued moving, picking up pace now, taking these enormous strides across the landscape. It was heading away from this white house I could see in the distance. I later wondered if it had been near that property for some reason. The way it moved was incredible, not lumbering or awkward at all, but with this athletic economy of motion. Its arms swung naturally at its sides as it ran. Each stride covered what had to be 6 or 7 feet of ground. It was booking it across terrain that would have most humans stumbling and tripping, over rocks, scrub brush and small washes, without even slowing down. I watched it for maybe 45 seconds total as it put more and more distance between itself and the highway. It moved with clear intention, like it knew exactly where it was going. Then it angled slightly and disappeared behind a rocky outcropping about a quarter mile from the road, and just like that, it was gone. I sat there breathing hard, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt weird, like I was going to throw up. My training had taught me to observe and report clearly, but what the hell was I supposed to report here? That I'd seen some kind of desert Bigfoot? That would have been career suicide in the army. A few minutes later, the guys all piled back into the van. Miller had fixed whatever was wrong, and we were back on the road. Someone asked if I was okay because apparently I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I just mumbled something about not feeling well from the heat. For the rest of that trip and throughout the funeral ceremony, I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept replaying those 45 seconds over and over. I kept seeing those eyes looking back at me. That night, back at base, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bunk trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was just a really tall guy in a ghillie suit. But that made no sense. No one would be out there in that heat, suited up like that, miles from anywhere. Besides, the proportions were all wrong. No human has that build naturally. The color of the thing still sticks with me. It wasn't brown like you hear about with Pacific Northwest Bigfoot stories. This was a perfect sandy tan that blended with the desert landscape. It was like looking at evolutionary camouflage in action. If that thing stood still against the right background, you'd walk right past it. Over the next few weeks, I drove myself crazy trying to find any reports of similar sightings in the area. This was pre-internet, so research meant library books and asking around. I found a few vague stories from local ranchers about desert devils and some older Native American legends about tall beings that lived in the more remote areas. Nothing concrete, though. I did manage to find out about the White House I'd seen. It was an isolated ranch property that had been abandoned for years. The locals avoided it because of water issues and bad soil. I sometimes wonder if that creature was using it somehow, as a shelter maybe, or a hunting ground for small game. About a month after the incident, I finally broke down and told my buddy Garcia about what I'd seen. He was the only one I trusted not to immediately write me off as insane. He listened without interrupting, then asked me these really specific questions about the creature's gait, proportions, and behavior. Turns out his grandfather, who'd lived his entire life in the Sonoran Desert, had seen something similar back in the 60s while working as a surveyor. Garcia's grandfather described a man-like desert spirit that could run for miles without tiring and knew the landscape better than any human. The old man had tracked it for almost a mile before losing it among the rocks. He called it El Corredor, the runner. That conversation with Garcia was the first time I considered that maybe this was a known phenomenon, just not one that most people talked about openly. Maybe there was an entire species of these beings living in the more remote parts of the desert, perfectly adapted to survive in conditions that would kill most humans within days. The military trains you to be observant, to notice details that others might miss. That day, I estimated the creature's height at around 6'5", maybe 6'6". It had to weigh at least 300 pounds, most of it muscle. Its stride length was twice what a human athlete could manage over rough terrain, and its coloration was perfect camouflage for the environment. What bothers me most even now is that look of recognition. This wasn't some mindless animal. Whatever I saw that day had intelligence behind its eyes. It knew it was being observed, and it made a decision to move on rather than hide or approach. That speaks to a kind of reasoning that's unsettling to think about. I left the army in 1993 and moved to Colorado. I've never been back to that stretch of Interstate 10, but sometimes I'll see something on the news about strange sightings in the Southwest, and I'll get that same cold feeling I had that day. I've spent years trying to convince myself it was just a weird trick of light or exhaustion from lack of sleep, or maybe even a brief hallucination from heat exposure. But deep down, I know what I saw. I know it was real. That thing was out there, moving through a landscape most people consider empty, watching and being watched in return. I wonder how many other people have seen it over the years. How many others have caught that fleeting glimpse of something impossible moving across the desert and then kept quiet about it because they knew no one would believe them. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, running across the desert, those powerful legs carrying it effortlessly over terrain that would exhaust or injure most humans. I wonder if it has a family, a community, or if it's solitary. I wonder if it has a language, a culture, a whole world hidden from us in plain sight. The worst part is not knowing, not having answers. Seeing something that changes your entire understanding of what exists in the world and then having to carry that knowledge alone because it sounds too crazy to share. I'm 44 now, with a family and a normal life. I work as a project manager for a construction company. Nothing in my day-to-day would suggest I once saw something that science says shouldn't exist. But I did see it, as clearly as I'm seeing this screen right now. And not a week goes by that I don't think about those 45 seconds on that desert highway and wonder what else might be out there just beyond our peripheral vision, watching us when we think we're alone. I still have dreams about those eyes, those intelligent, aware eyes that seem to look right through me. In the dreams, instead of running away, the creature starts running toward me, covering the distance between us with those impossible strides. I always wake up before it reaches me, my heart racing, the sheets soaked with sweat. I don't know what to call what I saw that day. A desert Sasquatch, a southwestern Bigfoot, an unknown hominid species. All I know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and its existence challenges everything we think we know about what lives alongside us on this planet. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I just needed to finally get this out there after all these years. Maybe someone else has seen the same thing in that area. Maybe I'm not alone in carrying this knowledge. Or maybe I am, and that's just something I'll have to live with. All I know for certain is that on that brutally hot July morning in 1990, while sitting in a broken-down military van on Interstate 10 in Arizona, I saw something impossible running across the desert, and nothing has felt quite the same since. Story 12. I still can't explain what happened to us at the Mogollon Rim last year. My wife Alicia and I talk about it sometimes, but we always end up with more questions than answers. I'm finally writing this all down, partly to process it myself, and partly because I'm hoping someone here might have experienced something similar. It was mid-August of 2022 when we decided to take a long weekend camping trip. As software engineers, we both needed a break from screens and deadlines. We work remotely, and the constant video calls and debugging sessions were draining us both. The Mogollon Rim seemed perfect. Gorgeous scenery, but still within a few hours' drive from our place in Phoenix. We packed up our Subaru Outback with our gear, loaded our two small dogs, Pixel, a Jack Russell mix, and Widget, a scrappy little terrier, into their travel crates and headed north. We'd been to Woods Canyon Lake before, but this time we wanted something more remote. I'd found some dispersed camping areas north of the lake on a Forest Service map, spots where you could just pull off and set up camp without reservations or designated sites. The forecast mentioned afternoon thunderstorms, but we weren't too worried. We had good rain gear and a solid tent. As we drove deeper into the forest on this narrow dirt road, the rain started coming down pretty hard. I mean, it wasn't a downpour, but it was steady enough that I had to slow down to see through the windshield properly. The road got rougher the further we went. Alicia kept checking her phone's map, but the signal was getting spotty. Maybe we should turn back and go to one of the established campgrounds, she suggested as we bounced through another pothole. But I was determined to find our isolated spot. Let's just go a bit further, I said. I want to get away from people for once. Man, did I get my wish. By the time we found what looked like a decent clearing about 200 yards off the road, it was around 2 in the afternoon. The rain was still falling, and we hadn't seen another vehicle for at least an hour. I backed the Subaru close to some trees for a bit of shelter, and we sat there for about 15 minutes, hoping the rain would let up. It didn't. Eventually, we just had to make a dash for it. We put on our rain jackets and set up our tent as quickly as possible, getting soaked in the process. The dogs weren't happy either. They hate the rain. We got them settled in the tent with their beds while we unloaded the rest of our gear. What struck me immediately was how quiet it was. Even with the rain pattering on leaves and our tent, there was this underlying silence that felt different. No distant traffic noise, no planes overhead, no human sounds at all. Just us, the rain, and miles of forest. By 5 or so, the rain finally stopped, but everything was completely drenched. I tried to get a fire going, but it was a nightmare. All the dead wood around us was waterlogged. After multiple failed attempts with fire starters and paper, I got frustrated and grabbed my hatchet. I'm going to find some standing deadwood, I told Alicia. At least the insides might be dry. I spent about an hour chopping at dead branches and small trees. Looking back, I was making a ton of noise, the hatchet echoing through the trees with every swing. At the time, I was just annoyed about the wet conditions and focused on getting that fire started. When I finally got back to camp with an armful of splintered branches, Alicia had let the dogs out to explore our little clearing. They were sniffing around cautiously, which I thought was odd. Usually they're overexcited balls of energy when we're outdoors. They're acting weird, Alicia said, watching Pixel tiptoe around the perimeter of our campsite. Maybe they're just tired from the drive. After another 20 minutes of careful fire building, I finally got some flames going. The wood hissed and popped as the moisture escaped, but it burned well enough once it got going. We set up our camp chairs and cooked a simple dinner of hot dogs and beans on our little camp stove. As twilight deepened, I noticed something that hadn't registered earlier. The forest was unnaturally quiet. "Do you hear that?" I asked Alicia. "Hear what?" "Exactly. No birds, no insects, nothing." She cocked her head, listening. "Huh? Maybe it's because of the rain earlier?" "Maybe," I said, but something about it felt off. In all our previous camping trips, dusk was when the forest came alive with sounds, crickets chirping, frogs croaking, night birds calling. Here, there was just the occasional crack from our campfire and the soft rustle of wind through wet leaves. As night fell completely, we noticed how bright it was. A full moon had risen, casting everything in this eerie blue-white glow. The clearing was almost as bright as daytime, with deep shadows under the trees. It was beautiful but somehow unsettling. At around 10, we added more wood to the fire and decided to turn in. The temperature had dropped considerably, and we were both tired from setting up camp in the rain. We let the dogs do their business one last time, then all piled into our tent. Despite the unusual silence, I fell asleep quickly. I woke up suddenly, completely alert. Something had jolted me from deep sleep. I fumbled for my phone to check the time, 3:10 in the morning. Alicia was stirring beside me, and both dogs were sitting upright in their beds, completely still and staring at the tent wall. Then I heard it again, what had woken me. It was a scream. No, not a scream. A vocalization of some kind, but nothing like I've ever heard before or since. Imagine the loudest, most powerful howl you can think of, but with complexity to it, starting low and rising to a pitch that seemed impossible. It wasn't a wolf or a coyote. It wasn't an elk bugle or a mountain lion. It was like someone had taken elements of all those sounds, amplified them tenfold, and projected them through some kind of massive speaker system. The sound echoed across the canyon to the north of us. I could actually feel the vibration of it in my chest. It was that powerful. "What the fuck is that?" Alicia whispered, clutching my arm. I had no answer. The dogs were still frozen, not barking, not whining, just staring intently. That was perhaps the most unnerving part. Our dogs bark at everything. Delivery people, squirrels, random noises, but now they were dead silent, ears perked forward, completely focused. The vocalization stopped for maybe 30 seconds, then started again, this time in a series of shorter calls, each one slightly different in pitch and duration. It continued like this for what felt like forever, but was probably more like 5 to 10 minutes. We sat there in the tent, hardly breathing, listening to this impossible sound. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was almost as terrifying. We waited, straining our ears for any follow-up, for approaching footsteps, for anything. After about 30 minutes of nothing but silence, I finally worked up the courage to look outside. The moonlight was still incredibly bright, illuminating our little clearing in detail. I slowly unzipped the tent, half expecting to see something standing just outside. There was nothing. The campfire had burned down to embers. The forest looked exactly as it had when we'd gone to bed. Peaceful, still, bathed in moonlight. I stepped out cautiously, turning in a slow circle, peering into the trees. Alicia followed with her phone's flashlight, sweeping it across the clearing and into the forest edge. "See anything?" she whispered. "No," I replied, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. "Nothing." The dogs had finally moved but refused to leave the tent. Pixel was hiding in his bed, and Widget was peeking out the tent door but wouldn't step outside. We stood there for maybe 5 minutes, scanning the woods, listening. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. Eventually, the cold drove us back into our sleeping bags, but neither of us slept much for the rest of the night. The dogs remained alert and watchful until dawn finally broke. In the morning light, everything looked normal. Birds were singing again, the sun was shining, and it was as if the strange events of the night had been a shared nightmare. I made coffee on our camp stove, while Alicia took the dogs for their morning walk around the clearing. "I'm going to look around a bit," I told her after breakfast. "I want to see if there's anything in the direction of that sound." "Be careful," she said, looking uneasy. "Don't go too far." "I'll stay within shouting distance," I promised, grabbing my hatchet. Not that it would do much good against whatever could make a sound like that, but it made me feel better. I headed north, in the direction the vocalization had come from. The forest was open enough to walk through easily, with tall ponderosa pines, creating a cathedral-like space. About 200 yards from our camp, I stopped dead in my tracks. In a small clearing stood what I can only describe as a structure. Not a natural formation, a deliberate construction. It was made of large dead trees, each around 12 to 15 feet long and maybe 4 to 5 inches in diameter at their thickest point. They were arranged upright, leaning against each other to form a kind of teepee or cone shape. I approached it cautiously. One log lay on the ground nearby, and out of curiosity I tried to lift it. I couldn't. I could barely shift it. Each of these logs probably weighed at least 200 pounds, maybe more. And yet there they were, carefully balanced against each other in this bizarre formation. Looking closer, I noticed cuts at the ends of some logs, clean cuts that looked like they'd been made with a saw. But who would haul these massive logs out here, and why? There were no stumps in the immediate area, meaning these trees hadn't been cut down right here. They'd been transported from somewhere else. I stood there, trying to make sense of it. A hunter's blind, maybe, but it was far too large and cumbersome for that. Some kind of forestry project? But there were no markers, no signs, and no reasonable way to get equipment back here to move these logs. I took some photos with my phone, then hurried back to camp, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt out there alone. When I showed Alicia the pictures, she frowned. That's weird. Could someone have built it? Someone would need equipment to move those logs. We haven't seen any vehicles or heard any machinery. And why would anyone build that thing way out here? We spent the day hiking, fishing at a small stream we found, and trying to act normal. But there was an undercurrent of tension. We kept looking over our shoulders, scanning the forest edge. The dogs seemed on edge too, staying closer to us than usual. As evening approached, neither of us mentioned leaving early, though I think we were both considering it. We had planned to stay 2 nights, and some stubborn part of me didn't want to be chased away by whatever it was. We built our fire earlier that night, stockpiling enough wood to keep it going until morning if needed. Dinner was a subdued affair, both of us watching the tree line as the shadows lengthened. "What do you think made that sound?" Alicia finally asked, voicing what we'd been avoiding all day. "I don't know," I admitted. "It wasn't anything I recognized. Too loud to be a normal animal." "Could it have been a person with some kind of amplification device? Like a prank?" I considered this. Out here, miles from any road where they could set up equipment. And for what purpose? As darkness fell, the dogs' behavior changed. They began pacing around the fire, occasionally growling at the western tree line. Widget would stop, stare intently into the darkness, then resume her nervous pacing. Pixel actually refused to leave Alicia's side, pressing against her leg and trembling slightly. "They hear something," Alicia whispered around 9:30. I strained my ears but caught nothing unusual. I grabbed our high-powered flashlight and shone it in the direction the dogs were staring. The beam cut through the darkness for maybe 100 feet, but revealed nothing out of the ordinary. A few minutes later, Alicia grabbed my arm. "I heard something moving over there," she hissed, nodding toward the same section of forest. I stood up, flashlight in one hand, hatchet in the other, and called out, "Hello, is someone there?" My voice sounded small and ineffectual against the vast darkness. No response came, but both dogs were now growling continuously, their eyes fixed on the same spot. I swept the flashlight back and forth, trying to catch any movement, any reflection of eyes, anything. Nothing. We stayed up late that night, feeding the fire, keeping watch. The sounds never escalated beyond what might have been natural forest noises, the crack of twigs, the rustle of leaves. But the dogs remained agitated until we finally retreated to the tent around midnight. I slept fitfully, waking at every small sound. The vocalization didn't repeat, but I almost wish it had. At least then we'd know for sure we hadn't imagined it. The uncertainty was worse somehow. In the morning, we packed up quickly. Before leaving, I went back to check the structure one more time. It was exactly as before, impossibly heavy logs arranged with careful precision. I walked a wider circle around it this time, confirming there were no stumps nearby that could account for the trees, no tire tracks, no evidence of machinery that could have transported them. Just this bizarre construction in the middle of nowhere, built by something with strength far beyond what I could muster. As we drove away, I kept thinking about that vocalization, how it had resonated in my chest, how it had paralyzed even our yappy little dogs into silence, how it had sounded almost like communication rather than a random animal call, and about that structure requiring strength and purpose that defied easy explanation. I've researched since then, looking into known wildlife in the area, checking Forest Service records for any projects that might explain the structure. I've even cautiously looked into Bigfoot reports from the Mogollon Rim area. There are more than you might think. I'm not saying that's what we encountered. I'm honestly not sure what to think. But something was out there in those woods, something powerful enough to move logs I could barely shift, something with a voice that could echo for miles, something intelligent enough to construct a deliberate structure far from any road or trail. Whatever it was, it left us alone. But I can't shake the feeling that it was watching us the entire time, assessing us from just beyond the reach of our flashlight beams. And sometimes, when I'm drifting off to sleep at night, I can still feel that vocalization vibrating in my chest, calling out across the silent forest. Story 13. I've never told this story to anyone outside my immediate family. Even now, 25 years later, I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened that day in May of 1998. I was 13 years old, camping with my family at Oak Creek Canyon near Slide Rock State Park in Arizona. It was supposed to be an awesome Memorial Day weekend getaway. Dad had been planning it for months, our first big camping trip after moving to Phoenix from Chicago the previous summer. I remember being so excited because Oak Creek Canyon was supposed to be this beautiful place with swimming holes and natural water slides. Plus, I'd just gotten a new disposable camera and couldn't wait to use it. We arrived on Friday afternoon, the weekend before Memorial Day, hoping to beat the worst of the crowds. The campground wasn't completely full yet, and Dad managed to snag us a decent spot not too far from the creek. Mom was worried about being close to the water because my little sister Emma was only 6 and my brother Jake was 9. But Dad promised we'd keep an eye on them, and I was old enough to help out. That Saturday started off perfectly normal. We had breakfast at the campsite, eggs and bacon cooked on the portable stove. Dad kept saying how good food tastes when you're outdoors. Mom was organizing things for a picnic lunch, and Emma and Jake were fighting over who got to sit in the good camping chair. Just normal kid stuff. It was around 10 in the morning when Dad suggested we go check out Slide Rock. If you've never been there, it's this amazing natural water slide formed by the smooth red rocks in Oak Creek. The water flows over this slippery algae that makes it perfect for sliding. Mom said she needed more time to prepare lunch, so Dad offered to take us kids ahead to scope it out. "Daniel," he said to me, "help me get the towels and water bottles together." I remember being annoyed because I wanted to keep reading my Goosebumps book, but I did as I was told. Jake and Emma were bouncing around like they'd had too much sugar, even though Mom had been strict about the cereal that morning. The walk to the main area of Slide Rock wasn't far, maybe 15 minutes from our campsite. It was a beautiful day, warm but not too hot, with a clear blue sky. The kind of perfect day that makes you forget anything bad could ever happen. When we got to Slide Rock, there were already some people there, but it wasn't packed yet. Dad found us a spot to put our stuff down, and Jake immediately wanted to get in the water. Dad told me to stay with Emma while he took Jake to try the slides first. Emma was complaining because she wanted to go too, but Dad said he needed to check how fast the water was moving before letting her try. So there I was, sitting on a rock with my little sister, watching Dad and Jake make their way toward the main sliding area. Emma was pouting, picking up small rocks and throwing them into the water. "I'm bored," she whined, kicking at the dirt with her pink water shoes. "Just wait," I told her. "Dad will be back in a few minutes and then you can go." "I'm going to look for pretty rocks," she announced. I nodded, watching her closely as she searched the ground nearby. I took out my camera and snapped a few pictures of the scenery, the red rocks contrasting against the blue sky, the clear water flowing over smooth stone. That's when I first noticed it. I was looking through the little viewfinder, trying to frame a good shot of the canyon wall across the creek, when I saw something move between the trees. At first, I thought it was just another hiker making their way along one of the trails that ran through the area. But then I lowered my camera and looked directly, and whatever it was seemed bigger. From where I was sitting, it looked like a dark figure standing partially hidden among the juniper trees and brush on the opposite bank, maybe 100 yards upstream. The strange thing was how still it stood. Most hikers would be moving along the trail, not just standing there staring, and it was staring. I couldn't see a face clearly from that distance, but somehow I knew it was looking right at us. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "Emma!" I called, not taking my eyes off the figure. "Come back over here." Emma ignored me, now squatting by the water's edge a few yards away. I stood up, still watching the figure. It hadn't moved, but something about it felt wrong. It was too tall to be a normal person and too still. I tried to convince myself it was just a shadow or a dead tree I was misinterpreting. "Emma!" I called more urgently. "Come here right now!" She looked up at me with annoyance, but must have heard something in my voice because she actually listened and came trudging back. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," I said, not wanting to scare her. "Just stay close, okay?" I looked back toward where Dad and Jake had gone, wishing they would hurry up and return. When I looked back to the spot across the creek, the figure was gone. Relief washed over me. Just my imagination, I told myself. I'd been reading too many scary stories before bed. Dad and Jake came back about 10 minutes later, both of them soaking wet and laughing. "It's awesome," Jake exclaimed. "The water's not too cold and the slide is super fast." Dad rubbed his hand through Jake's wet hair. "Ready to give it a try, Emma?" Emma jumped up and down with excitement, her earlier frustration forgotten. Dad looked at me. "You coming, Daniel?" I hesitated, glancing back toward where I'd seen the figure. "Yeah," I decided. "I'm coming." We spent the next hour or so taking turns on the natural water slides. The fun of it pushed my concerns away, and I started to relax. The water was cool and refreshing in the May heat, and sliding down the smooth rock surface was like being on a natural amusement park ride. Dad even convinced Mum to join us when she arrived with lunch around noon. We ate sandwiches sitting on towels spread across the flat rocks. More people had shown up by then, and the area was getting crowded. Mom wanted to head back to the campsite after lunch for Emma's nap, but Dad suggested we explore a bit further upstream, where there might be some quieter pools for swimming. "There's a trail that follows the creek," he said, pointing. "The ranger mentioned there are some nice spots up there with fewer people." Mom agreed, and we packed up our things. That's when I noticed the odd silence. Despite there being at least 30 people in the immediate area, the birds had stopped singing. I remember thinking how strange that was, like in those moments before a big thunderstorm when everything gets quiet. As we started walking along the trail that followed the creek, I kept looking around. The feeling of being watched had returned, stronger now. I was at the back of our little group, with Dad leading the way, Mom and Emma in the middle, and Jake just ahead of me. "Did you see anything weird earlier?" I asked Jake quietly. "Like what?" he asked, more interested in throwing pebbles into the water as we walked. "I don't know. Like someone watching us." He gave me a weird look. "No. Why? Did you?" I shrugged. Maybe. Probably nothing. The trail narrowed as we continued upstream, the canyon walls closing in slightly on either side. We were getting further from the crowded tourist area, and I noticed fewer and fewer people as we went. After about a quarter mile, Dad found what he was looking for, a small, secluded pool where the creek widened slightly before continuing downstream. "This looks perfect," he announced, "and we have it all to ourselves." The pool was beautiful, with clear water flowing gently over smooth stones. A large sycamore tree provided some shade on one side, and flat rocks offered perfect places to sit. Under normal circumstances, I would have loved it, but something felt off. As everyone was setting up our stuff again, I kept scanning the trees and rocks around us. The canyon walls weren't super steep here, but they were dotted with pine, juniper, and oak trees that created numerous shadowy areas. Perfect hiding spots. "Daniel, are you going to swim?" Mom asked, noticing my distraction. "In a minute," I said. I walked a few yards away from our spot, pretending to take pictures with my camera, but really just trying to look around more carefully. That's when I smelled it. A strange, powerful odor that I can only describe as a mix of wet dog, rotting vegetation, and something musky. It was so strong that I actually covered my nose. "Do you smell that?" I asked, turning back to my family. Dad sniffed the air. "Smell what?" "That, I don't know. It's like something died." Mom frowned. "I don't smell anything, honey." I took a few more steps away, following the smell. It seemed strongest near a cluster of boulders at the edge of the clearing. Looking back, I realized how stupid it was to move toward the smell rather than away from it, but I was 13 and curious. As I approached the boulders, the hair on my arm stood up. The smell was definitely coming from behind them. I raised my camera, not to take a picture, but because it was the only thing in my hands, and somehow it made me feel less vulnerable. I took one step around the edge of the largest boulder, and that's when I heard it, a deep, rumbling sound, almost like a growl, but not quite. More like a warning. It was so low I felt it more than heard it. I froze. From behind the boulder, no more than 15 feet away, a massive dark shape rose up. It had been crouching, and as it stood to its full height, it was easily 7 or 8 feet tall. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. All I could do was stare as this creature stared back at me with eyes that looked disturbingly intelligent. It wasn't a bear. I knew what bears looked like from books and TV. This was something else entirely. It stood on 2 legs like a human, but was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, and its arms hung long at its sides, ending in what looked like hands with fingers, not paws. But the face, that's what I remember most clearly. It wasn't quite human, with a pronounced brow ridge and a flat nose, but the eyes, they were looking at me with an awareness that no animal should have. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Then it made that sound again, that deep chest rumbling growl, and I finally found my voice. "Dad!" I screamed, stumbling backward. "Dad!" I heard my father shout something in response. His voice panicked, and the creature's head snapped in that direction. It looked back at me one more time, and then, with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large, it turned and moved into the trees. I ran back to my family, nearly tripping over my own feet. Dad was already rushing toward me, with Mom gathering Emma and Jake close to her. "What? What is it?" Dad demanded, grabbing my shoulders. "There's something," I was gasping, pointing wildly back toward the boulders. "Something big. It was right there. It stood up." Dad looked where I was pointing, his face serious. "A bear?" No, it wasn't a bear," I insisted. "It was standing like a person. It was huge and covered in hair and—" Okay, Dad said, his voice calm but firm. "Let's get our things. We're leaving." Mom didn't ask questions, just quickly gathered our belongings while keeping Emma and Jake close. They looked scared, picking up on the tension. "What did Daniel see?" Jake kept asking. "Nothing, honey," Mom said. "Probably just a deer that startled him." But the way she and Dad were moving, quickly and deliberately, told me they weren't taking any chances. As we hurried back down the trail, I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I could feel eyes watching us from the trees. The smell lingered in my nostrils, and I couldn't shake the image of those intelligent eyes studying me. We reached the main slide rock area again, now crowded with tourists enjoying the water. Dad slowed our pace, probably not wanting to cause a panic. As we walked through the crowd, I felt a strange sense of safety in numbers, but also an odd disconnect. All these people having fun, completely unaware of what was lurking just up the creek. "Daniel," Dad said quietly as we walked, "are you absolutely sure about what you saw?" "Yes," I insisted. "I'm not making it up, Dad. It wasn't a bear, and it definitely wasn't a deer." He nodded slowly. "I believe you saw something that scared you. Let's just get back to camp and decide what to do from there." When we reached our campsite, Dad and Mom had a hushed conversation while I sat with Emma and Jake at the picnic table. They kept asking me what I'd seen, but I just shook my head, not wanting to scare them more. "We're going to pack up and head home," Dad announced after a few minutes. "It's getting crowded here anyway, and there's supposed to be a storm coming in tonight." I knew there was no storm forecasted. He just wanted an excuse to leave that wouldn't frighten my siblings. As we were packing up, a park ranger came by on routine patrol. Dad hesitated, then waved him over. "Excuse me, Ranger," Dad said. "Is there any history of unusual wildlife sightings in this area?" The ranger, a young guy probably in his 20s, looked confused. "Unusual how? We get the occasional black bear, mountain lions sometimes, but they generally avoid people." Dad glanced at me. "My son thought he saw something up the creek, something big that was standing on two legs. I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding, but..." The ranger's expression changed slightly. It was subtle, but I caught it, a flicker of recognition before his face returned to professional neutrality. "Probably just a bear standing up to get a better look," he said too quickly. "They do that sometimes." "Where exactly did you see this?" I described the location, and as I did, I noticed the ranger's knuckles whitening where he gripped his belt. "I'd recommend sticking to the main areas of the park," he said when I finished. "There have been a few incidents up that way, probably just vandals or someone messing around, but we're keeping an eye on it." He didn't elaborate on what kind of incidents, and Dad didn't ask, but as the ranger walked away, he turned back. "If you don't mind some advice," he said quietly, "I'd camp somewhere else tonight. Munn's Park is nice this time of year." We didn't need more convincing. Within an hour, we had our campsite packed up and were driving away from Oak Creek Canyon. Nobody spoke much during the drive home to Phoenix. Emma and Jake fell asleep in the back seat, and I stared out the window, watching the landscape change from forested canyon to desert scrub. That night, after Emma and Jake were in bed, I overheard Dad on the phone with someone. I couldn't hear the whole conversation, but I caught phrases like, "I don't know what to think," and "my son doesn't make things up," and "almost 8 feet tall." The next morning, Dad sat me down and asked me to describe exactly what I'd seen, in detail. He didn't interrupt or tell me I was imagining things, he just listened. When I finished, he nodded and said, "There are things in this world we don't understand, Daniel. I can't explain what you saw, but I believe you saw something." It was the only time we ever really talked about it. Mom insisted we never mention it to Emma and Jake, not wanting to scare them. And over time, it became this unspoken thing in our family, the reason we never camped at Oak Creek again. Years later, when I was in college, I stumbled across an online forum where people shared encounters with what they called Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Reading their descriptions sent chills down my spine. The height, The hair color, the intelligent eyes, the powerful smell, it all matched what I'd seen that day at Slide Rock. I've spent hours researching similar encounters in the southwest, particularly around the Mogollon Rim area near Sedona. There are more than you might think. Native American legends from the region speak of a creature they call the Big Man that inhabits the canyons and forests. I still have the disposable camera from that trip. I never got the film developed. Sometimes, I wonder if I captured anything in those frames. A blur, a shadow, something that would prove what I saw was real. But honestly, I'm afraid to find out. Part of me doesn't want confirmation of what I already know. What I saw that day at Slide Rock was real. It was watching my family. It could have hurt us, but it didn't. Why it chose to reveal itself to me, I'll never know. But 25 years later, I still can't shake the feeling that somewhere in those Arizona canyons, those intelligent eyes are still watching and waiting. Story 14. My oldest, Jamie, was 12 then, playing some handheld game with the volume too loud, while my younger one, Ellie, she was 8, had finally dozed off after complaining about her stomach for the past 20 miles. I remember thinking how Highway 65 seemed unusually busy for that time on a Thursday night. Maybe everyone was out hitting those early Black Friday sales or returning from family visits like us. The traffic had slowed to a crawl near that intersection by the old paper mill. You know, the one where they put in those new traffic lights last year. Back then, it was just a regular intersection with a gas station on one corner. I remember I was low on fuel, and I was calculating in my head whether I should stop or if I could make it home with what I had in the tank. That's when I first noticed it. Initially, I thought someone had pulled over with car trouble or something. There was this dark shape crouched down by the shoulder of the road, maybe 30 feet ahead of us. The headlights from the cars weren't hitting it directly, but there was enough ambient light from the gas station nearby that I could make out a silhouette. My first reaction wasn't fear, just curiosity. I actually remember thinking, who would be kneeling on the side of the highway at this hour? The traffic inched forward, and I had to tap my brakes because the pickup truck in front of me stopped suddenly. I was getting annoyed, exhausted from the long day, and just wanted to get home and put the kids to bed. Jamie was asking if we could stop for a bathroom break, and I was trying to decide if we should just wait until we got home. That's when it happened. The thing stood up. I want to make this absolutely clear. What I saw wasn't a person. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't any animal I've ever seen in my life, and I've lived in Louisiana my entire 43 years. This thing unfolded itself from its crouching position and stood upright on 2 legs. My truck is a Ford F-150, not a small vehicle by any means, and this creature was taller than my cab, significantly taller. It must have been at least 7, maybe 8 feet high. My hands froze on the steering wheel. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just stared. The shape was unmistakably humanoid, but massive. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, probably twice the width of a large man's. Even in the dim light, I could make out powerful, muscular arms that hung down much longer than a human's would. The proportions were all wrong. Too big, too powerful. The creature was covered in what looked like dark fur or hair. It wasn't wearing clothes, that's for sure. In the yellowish glow from the gas station lights, I thought the color was a deep brown or black, but it was hard to tell exactly. What strikes me most, even now, was how it moved. There was nothing jerky or awkward about it. This thing stood up with this fluid, natural motion, like it was the most normal thing in the world to be crouching beside a highway in Louisiana and then casually rise to its full height. Traffic started moving again, and my truck was getting closer to where it stood. I remember my foot hovering between the brake and the gas pedal, unsure whether to stop completely or speed up to get past it quicker. It turned slightly, not fully toward me, but enough that I caught a glimpse of its profile. The head sat directly on those massive shoulders, with hardly any neck visible. The face was in shadow, but I could make out what seemed to be a pronounced brow ridge jutting out over where its eyes would be. Then, with the same eerie calmness, it simply stepped off the shoulder of the road and into the darkness. Just a couple of strides, and it was gone into the tree line. All this happened in the span of maybe 10 or 15 seconds, but it felt like time had stretched out forever. As my truck passed the spot where it had been standing, I couldn't help but look out my window into the darkness. There was nothing to see, just the black void of trees and undergrowth beyond the highway's edge. "Mom?" Jamie's voice snapped me back to reality. "What was that?" My blood ran cold. "What was what, honey?" I asked, hoping he hadn't seen what I had. "That big hairy guy by the road. Was that a bear standing up?" So he'd seen it too. It wasn't just my imagination. My 8-year-old son had witnessed the same thing I had. I'm not sure what it was," I answered honestly, my voice shaking slightly. I checked the rearview mirror to see if Ellie was still asleep, and thankfully she was. For the rest of the drive home, which couldn't have been more than 15 minutes, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see that thing following us, or maybe crossing the road behind us. My hands were sweating so much the steering wheel felt slippery. I kept the doors locked and windows up, even though it was a mild night. When we got home, I hurried the kids inside, constantly looking over my shoulder at the edge of our property where the woods begin. Our house is set back from the main road, with about a quarter acre of land before the forest starts. That night, those trees seemed more threatening than they ever had before. I couldn't sleep at all. I kept replaying what I'd seen over and over in my mind, trying to rationalize it. Could it have been a man in a costume? But who would do that and why? The movements were too natural, too fluid. Could it have been some kind of animal I'd never seen before? But what animal stands that tall on 2 legs and moves with such purpose? The next morning, I debated whether to tell my husband, Mark. He was away on a business trip and due back that evening. Mark's always been the practical one, the skeptic who needs solid evidence before believing anything out of the ordinary. I knew what his reaction would be. He'd tell me I was tired, that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But Jamie had seen it too. I decided to bring it up casually with Jamie during breakfast to see if his recollection matched mine. "Hey, Jamie, remember that thing we saw on the side of the road last night?" I asked as nonchalantly as possible while pouring his cereal. He nodded, his mouth full of Cheerios. When he swallowed, he said, "That big monkey man?" "Monkey man?" I repeated. "Yeah, but way bigger than a person, like a giant monkey walking like a person." He demonstrated by hunching his shoulders and letting his arms hang down. But it was super tall. His description matched what I'd seen. It wasn't just me. I spent that day researching online, trying to find any similar sightings in the Minden area. To my surprise, there were quite a few reports over the years. Nothing recent, but enough to establish a pattern. People described encounters with large, hairy, upright creatures in the forests around our town. Most of these sightings were brief glimpses from a distance or strange sounds in the night, but they all shared similar details. Before this, I'd always rolled my eyes at those stories. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, that was just nonsense for cryptid hunters and conspiracy theorists, not something a rational adult would believe in. But now I was questioning everything I thought I knew. When Mark got home that evening, I decided not to tell him right away. I needed time to process what had happened, to figure out how to explain it without sounding completely unhinged. But Jamie had no such reservations. "Dad, we saw a Bigfoot last night," he announced as soon as Mark walked through the door. Mark laughed and ruffled Jamie's hair. "Is that right? And was he driving a UFO?" "No, Dad, seriously. Ask Mom. It was on the highway coming back from Aunt Linda's." Mark looked at me with raised eyebrows, clearly expecting me to dismiss Jamie's story with a smile or a wink. But I couldn't. My face must have given away something because his amused expression quickly faded. Eleanor? What's he talking about? I took a deep breath. We saw something last night on the drive home. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't normal. I told him everything. The crouching figure, how it stood up to its full impressive height, the way it moved, the proportions all wrong for a human. I described how it simply walked off into the darkness with those long, powerful strides. Mark listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You're serious about this," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "I am, and Jamie saw it too. It wasn't my imagination, Mark. I know what I saw." He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I believe that you believe it, Eleanor. But there's got to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was someone playing a prank, or a hunter in some kind of ghillie suit. Or maybe it was a bear. They can stand on their back legs, you know." "It wasn't a bear," Jamie insisted. "Bears don't walk like people." Mark didn't press the issue further that night, but I could tell he was concerned. Not about Bigfoot, but about me. Over the next few days, he kept giving me these looks, like he was waiting for me to admit it had all been a misunderstanding. But I knew what I'd seen, and it changed something fundamental in how I viewed the world around me. I started paying more attention to the woods behind our house. Sometimes, early in the morning or late in the evening, I'd stand on our back porch and just listen to the forest. Were those rustling sounds just the wind in the trees? Was that crack of a branch just a normal forest sound, or was something large moving out there? I began collecting local stories too. I'd casually bring up the subject with neighbors or people at the grocery store. "Ever heard about anything strange in the woods around here?" I'd ask. Most people would laugh it off or mention typical local legends, but occasionally someone would get a serious look and tell me about a cousin or friend who'd had their own unexplainable encounter. One elderly man who'd lived in Minden his entire life told me that when he was a boy in the 50s, his grandfather warned him never to go into certain parts of the forest alone because of the wild men who lived there. He said the Native Americans who originally inhabited the area had stories about these creatures going back hundreds of years. About a week after our encounter, I drove back to that stretch of highway in the daytime. I'm not sure what I expected to find. Footprints, maybe, or some other sign that what I'd seen was real. Of course, there was nothing. Just the ordinary shoulder of the road, the ditch beyond it, and then the forest. I pulled over and got out of my car, standing where I thought the creature had been. The tree line was maybe 20 feet from the road's edge. I walked over and peered into the woods. They weren't particularly dense right there. I could see a fair distance between the trees. How could something that large disappear so quickly and completely? As I stood there, a strange feeling came over me, like I was being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had this overwhelming urge to get back in my car. I didn't hear anything unusual or see any movement, but some primal instinct was screaming at me to leave. I didn't linger. That feeling of being watched from the trees, it stayed with me. Sometimes I get it in my own backyard. Sometimes when I'm driving along rural roads. I've become acutely aware of the boundary between our civilized world and the wilderness beyond it, and how thin that boundary might actually be. Mark thinks I've become obsessed, and maybe I have. I've read every book I could find on Bigfoot encounters. I've joined online forums where people share their experiences. Some of what I read seems far-fetched even to me now, but other accounts, they're so similar to what Jamie and I saw that it sends chills down my spine. I've thought about reporting my sighting to one of those cryptozoology groups, but I haven't worked up the courage yet. I value my privacy, and I don't want to become that crazy Bigfoot lady in our small town. Plus, what would I tell them that hasn't been said 100 times before? I have no evidence, only my testimony and Jamie's. What I do have is the absolute certainty that what I saw that night was real, It wasn't a man in a costume, it wasn't a bear, it wasn't a trick of the light or my tired mind playing tricks on me. It was something that shouldn't exist according to conventional science, but it does. I've heard people say that seeing is believing, but I think it's more accurate to say that seeing changes everything. Before that night in November, my world was simpler, more defined. Now, I live with the knowledge that there are things out there we don't understand. Creatures that move through our world largely unseen, except for those brief, startling moments when our paths cross. Every time I drive down Highway 65 now, especially at night, I scan the shoulders of the road. Part of me hopes to see it again, to confirm what I know in my heart to be true. Another part of me dreads exactly that, because what would I do if it didn't just walk away next time? What if it approached our truck? What if it followed us home? I still haven't figured out what to do with this experience. All I know is that the forests around Minden don't seem the same to me anymore. They're deeper somehow, more mysterious. And sometimes, when I look out my kitchen window toward those trees at dusk, I can't shake the feeling that something might be looking back. Story 15. I've never been the type to believe in the supernatural or monsters or any of that crap. I'm pretty much your average guy. Work in construction, like fishing on weekends. And yeah, maybe have a few too many beers watching football with my buddies. But something happened to me 25 years ago that I still can't explain, and it freaks me out to this day. I've only told a handful of people, and most of them just laughed it off. My wife believes me, though, because she saw how shaken up I was when I got home that night. It was the spring of 1999. April, I think. I'd driven out to Paragould in northeast Arkansas to check out a potential job site. I was working as a foreman back then, and the company was bidding on a commercial building project. It was about a 4-hour drive from my home in Springdale, and I'd spent most of the day there going over plans with the client and taking measurements. By the time I wrapped everything up, it was already getting late. But I didn't want to spend money on a motel when I could just drive back home. I remember I was driving my old Ford F-150. It wasn't anything fancy, just a reliable work truck that had seen better days. I had the windows rolled up because it was one of those chilly spring evenings where you can still see your breath. The heater was cranked up, and I had the radio playing real low, some classic rock station that kept fading in and out as I drove through the hills. I left Paragould around 5 o'clock, and the sun was starting to set as I hit Highway 412 heading west. If you've never driven through rural Arkansas, it's nothing but winding roads cutting through dense forest and small towns. During the day, it's beautiful. At night, it's like driving through a tunnel of darkness. I passed through several small towns, Evening Shade, Hardy, Ashflat, stopping only once at a gas station to grab some coffee and use the bathroom. I remember the girl at the register asked if I was heading far, and I told her Springdale. She said, "Drive safe, those roads get real dark." At the time, I thought she just meant be careful not to hit a deer or drive off the road on a curve. Now, I wonder if she knew something else. It was about 9 o'clock when I passed through Salem. The traffic had thinned out to almost nothing. I might see another car every 10 minutes or so, but mostly I was alone on the road. My high beams were on, cutting through the darkness ahead of me, but they only illuminated about 100 feet of road at a time. Beyond that was just blackness. I wasn't tired yet. The coffee was doing its job, and I was thinking about the bid I'd have to prepare the next day. I was also looking forward to getting home and crawling into bed next to my wife. She was probably already asleep, but I'd been away since early morning and missed her. I remember I was somewhere between Salem and Mountain Home when it happened. The road there is particularly dark, with thick forest crowding in on both sides. The trees grow right up to the edge of the pavement in some places, and there are no streetlights, no houses, nothing but wilderness for long stretches. I was going about 65 miles per hour, which was right at the speed limit. I wasn't in a hurry, but I wasn't dawdling either. Just cruising along. keeping my eyes on the road and occasionally glancing at the tree line for deer. In Arkansas, hitting a deer is a real concern, especially at night, and I'd already had to replace one bumper because of it. At first, I thought it was just another tree standing at the edge of the road. There are places where the trees grow so close that their branches reach over the pavement. But something about this particular tree caught my eye. It seemed to be standing too close to the road, right on the white line, and there was something off about its shape. Too thick at the bottom, narrower at the top. As my truck got closer, maybe about 150 feet away, the tree moved. That's the only way I can describe it. It wasn't a branch swaying in the wind. It wasn't a shadow playing tricks. The whole damn thing turned like it was pivoting on one leg. I instinctively let off the gas, and my truck began to slow. My headlights were now shining directly at whatever this thing was, but it had already started moving away from the road. That's when I realized how massive it was. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe even 9, and it was wide, not fat but solid, like a linebacker or a heavyweight boxer, only much bigger. The thing that really struck me was the hair. Long matted hair covered its entire body, hanging down from its arms and back like dirty ropes. The color was hard to make out in my headlights, but it looked dark brown or maybe black, with patches that seemed grayer, especially around what I'm guessing was its shoulders. And it wasn't running on all fours, like a bear. This thing was walking upright on 2 legs, just like a human, but with a stride that covered ground faster than any person could. It never fully turned toward me, almost like it was deliberately keeping its face away from my headlights. The whole sighting lasted maybe 5 seconds. By the time my brain processed what I was seeing, the thing had already reached the tree line. It only took 3 or 4 strides for it to disappear completely into the forest. 1 second, it was there, this massive shape moving away from the road, and the next second, it was gone, swallowed by the darkness between the trees. I sat there for a split second, my foot now hovering over the gas pedal, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Then pure animal panic kicked in. I floored it. My old truck's engine roared as I accelerated way past the speed limit. I was doing 80, maybe 90 on those dark, winding roads, which was stupid and dangerous. But I wasn't thinking clearly. All I could think was, I need to get the hell out of here. I kept checking my rearview mirror every few seconds, like I expected to see that thing running after my truck. But the road behind me was empty. Just darkness and the fading red glow of my taillights. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was following me just beyond the reach of my headlights. It took about 20 minutes of driving like that before I reached Mountain Home, and seeing the lights of the town never felt so good. There were other people there, streetlights, open businesses, civilization. I pulled into a McDonald's parking lot and just sat in my truck for a while, trying to process what I'd seen. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my coffee cup. I think I might have been in a mild state of shock. I kept replaying those few seconds over and over in my mind, trying to convince myself that it was just a bear or maybe some guy in a costume. Though who the hell would be standing on the side of a deserted highway at 9 at night in a costume, I have no idea. But I knew it wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk upright like that, not for multiple strides and not with that fluid motion. And it wasn't a person either, unless people can suddenly grow to twice their normal size and move faster than Olympic sprinters through dense forest in the dark. After about 30 minutes in that McDonald's parking lot, I called my wife from a payphone. Cell phones weren't common back then, and I didn't have one yet. I woke her up, and she could tell right away something was wrong. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but I was stumbling over my words. I finally just said I'd had a scare on the road and would be home in a couple of hours. I didn't want her to think I was losing my mind. I got back on the road, but I drove the rest of the way home at exactly the speed limit, with one eye constantly checking the side of the road and the other on the rearview mirror. Every shadow, every tree, Every roadside reflector seemed to take on a sinister quality. I've never felt so on edge in my life. When I finally pulled into our driveway in Springdale, it was almost midnight. My wife was waiting up for me, worried sick. As soon as she saw my face, she knew something was seriously wrong. I broke down then, told her everything I'd seen. To her credit, she didn't laugh or tell me I was crazy. She just listened, made me some tea, and sat with me until I calmed down enough to go to bed. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that massive shape turning away from my headlights, those few powerful strides taking it into the protection of the forest. The image was burned into my brain. The next day I called in sick to work for the first time in years. I couldn't concentrate. I kept thinking about what I'd seen. That's when I started doing some research. I went to the library. This was before we had internet at home, and looked up anything I could find about strange sightings in Arkansas. I found some old newspaper clippings about wild men and bizarre creature encounters dating back to the 1950s, but nothing recent. It wasn't until a few years later, when I got more comfortable with the internet, that I really dove into research. That's when I first came across the term Bigfoot or Sasquatch in relation to what I might have seen. The descriptions matched: the height, the matted hair, the way it moved, the deliberate avoidance of direct human contact. Reading those accounts from other people was both terrifying and comforting. Terrifying because it confirmed that what I saw might actually exist, and comforting because it meant I wasn't losing my mind. Since that night, I've returned to that stretch of Highway 412 a few times during daylight hours. I even pulled over once, at approximately where I thought the sighting happened. The forest there is incredibly dense, with underbrush so thick you can barely see 10 feet in. I stood at the edge of the road, looking into those woods, and felt a chill run down my spine despite it being the middle of a hot summer day. I didn't venture in. Something told me it wouldn't be wise. I've often wondered what would have happened if I'd stopped my truck that night, if I'd gotten out and tried to get a better look or follow it into the woods. The thought makes my skin crawl. Whatever that thing was, it was powerful enough to snap me in half without breaking a sweat. And the way it moved, so deliberate, so aware of my presence without even looking directly at me, suggests an intelligence that's both familiar and alien at the same time. 25 years later, I still drive that route occasionally for work. I always slow down in that area, my eyes scanning the tree line. I've never seen anything like it again. But every time I drive that stretch of road at night, my heart rate picks up, and I find myself gripping the steering wheel just a little tighter. I've heard all the theories, that Bigfoot is some kind of undiscovered primate, that it's an interdimensional being, that it's all just misidentified bears or people in costumes playing pranks. I don't know what to believe. All I know is what I saw that night was real, it was massive, and it changed the way I look at the forests of Arkansas forever. Sometimes when I'm fishing or hiking in the woods, I get this feeling like I'm being watched. The forest will go completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. And the hair on the back of my neck stands up. I never linger when that happens. I pack up and leave immediately. I've come to believe that there are things in this world we don't understand. Things that prefer to remain hidden, watching us from the shadows. That night on Highway 412, I glimpsed something I wasn't meant to see. Something that has successfully stayed hidden from most of humanity, despite our cameras and technology and scientific advancements. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if it saw me too. If it remembers the man in the old Ford truck as clearly as I remember it. And I wonder if our paths ever cross again, whether I'll be lucky enough to just drive away.